Hedonic imperative, pain. Imagine it vanishing from existence, not just your pain, but all pain. Every agonized scream, every quiet desperation, every moment of suffering experienced by every conscious being on earth. Gone forever. Not through death or extinction, but through technology designed to reconfigure the very biology of suffering itself. This isn't science fiction, it's the hedonic imperative, a radical philosophical position that claims we have a moral obligation to use biotechnology to eradicate suffering from the biosphere entirely. The metabolic pathways of pain and malaise evolved because they served the fitness of our genes in the ancestral environment. They are now obsolete, declares philosopher David Pearce, the imperative's primary architect. We wouldn't design a robot to suffer any more than is functionally necessary. Why not extend the same compassion to all sentient beings? Unlike traditional philosophies that accept suffering as inevitable or even necessary for growth, the hedonic imperative proposes its complete elimination through direct neurological intervention. Not merely reducing suffering, abolishing it entirely from humans, animals, and any sentient life. This philosophy moves beyond palliative measures like painkillers or traditional psychological approaches, advocating instead for the fundamental redesign of consciousness itself. The vision is comprehensive and revolutionary: genetic engineering to eliminate predisposition to mental illness, nanotechnology to monitor and regulate neurochemistry, precision-edited genomes, ensuring no being ever experiences depression, anxiety, or chronic pain. CRISPR techniques that modify the pain circuits of wild animals to prevent predation suffering. A complete overhaul of nature's pain-based motivational systems, replaced with gradients of well-being. The world's last unpleasant experience will be a precisely datable event, Pearce boldly predicts. This isn't framed as mere possibility but moral imperative, a duty as binding as our obligation to rescue a drowning child or prevent genocide. If suffering is bad, a premise few would dispute, and if technology could eliminate it without greater harms, a more contentious claim, then we have an absolute ethical obligation to pursue this abolition. What makes this philosophy particularly controversial isn't just its ambition, but its comprehensive rejection of traditional value systems. Most spiritual traditions see suffering as meaningful, a path to enlightenment, a test of faith, or cosmic justice. Stoics view it as an opportunity for virtue. Existentialists find meaning in confronting life's inherent pains. The hedonic imperative dismisses these perspectives as rationalization of a brutal evolutionary legacy we now have the power to transcend. Pain and suffering were designed by natural selection to help our genes. We are now intelligent enough to realize that our genes have no moral standing, argues utilitarian philosopher Peter Singer, whose work influences hedonistic imperative thinking. We can pursue what we value, not what evolution programmed us to pursue. Critics raise profound objections. Religious thinkers view the philosophy as the ultimate hubris, humans playing God by redesigning nature's fundamental operations. Environmentalists warn against the ecological consequences of modifying predator-prey relationships that maintain ecosystem balance. Cultural conservatives fear loss of human authenticity in a world without struggle, while bioethicists question whether beings incapable of suffering would still be recognizably human. A life without the possibility of pain is a life without the possibility of meaning, argues philosopher Todd May. Our capacity to suffer is interwoven with our capacity to care deeply, to feel significance, to value authenticity. Eliminating one risks, eliminating all. This tension reaches its peak when considering wild animal suffering. The hedonic imperative doesn't stop at human suffering, but extends to the trillions of animals experiencing pain in nature. A gazelle being eaten alive by lions represents morally unconscionable suffering. The logical conclusion? We must intervene in nature itself, not through traditional conservation that preserves predator-prey relationships, but through biotechnological intervention that fundamentally restructures natural processes to eliminate suffering while maintaining ecological function. Imagine lions genetically modified to prefer synthetic meat. or predators whose neurological reward systems activate from proximity to prey rather than killing, or herbivores whose pain responses shut down during predation. These scenarios, while seemingly fantastical, represent serious proposals from philosophers who see natural suffering as a moral emergency demanding technological intervention. The total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation, Pierce writes. During the minute it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are being slowly devoured from within by rasping parasites. This extension into wild animal suffering creates strange political alignments. Traditional conservationists who value natural processes find themselves opposed to animal welfare advocates who prioritize individual suffering. Religious groups who view suffering as divinely ordained oppose secular technologists eager to improve on natural design. The philosophy transcends traditional left-right categorizations, creating unusual alliances and oppositions. The most sophisticated versions of the hedonic imperative don't advocate simply eliminating suffering while leaving everything else unchanged. They propose replacing our current experience with gradients of bliss, different intensities of well-being that would preserve motivation and meaning while eliminating the raw, negative character of suffering. In this vision, we would still be motivated to act, create, and connect, but through varying degrees of positive experience rather than the threat of pain. Why does our experience ever need to dip below hedonic zero? Asks Pierce. A civilization of super-intelligent beings animated entirely by gradients of well-being could accomplish anything we might aspire to achieve without ever experiencing a moment of suffering. How would such a transformation be implemented? Proponents envision a multi-phase approach. First, voluntary enhancement technologies, allowing individuals to recalibrate their own pain thresholds and emotional responses. Then, genetic screening and editing for parents to select for naturally high well-being in offspring. Eventually, coordinated global efforts to extend these modifications throughout the biosphere, potentially using advanced AI to manage ecological complexity beyond human comprehension. The philosophical roots drawing together the hedonic imperative are diverse. Utilitarianism provides the foundational value claim that suffering reduction is morally paramount. Transhumanism contributes the technological optimism that biology is modifiable. Buddhist compassion for all sentient beings extends the moral circle beyond humans. What emerges is a philosophy simultaneously radical in its vision, yet built from recognizable moral intuitions many already hold. Most people agree suffering is bad and its reduction good. The hedonic imperative simply follows this intuition to its logical endpoint. If suffering is bad, its complete elimination must be the ultimate moral project. The controversy emerges not from the basic premises, but from the breathtaking scope of their application. Whether viewed as compassionate utopianism or dangerous hubris, the hedonic imperative forces us to examine fundamental questions about consciousness, technology, and ethics. Is suffering truly separable from the fullness of human experience? Does our technological power to modify biology create moral obligations to use it? And most fundamentally, what kind of world do we want to create as our technological capabilities increasingly allow us to reshape not just our environment, but our very nature? As genetic technology and neuroscience advance, these philosophical questions move from theoretical speculation to practical decision points. The world envisioned by the hedonic imperative may be centuries away, but each step toward greater biotechnological control over consciousness brings us closer to confronting its central challenge. If we could end suffering forever, would we? And if not, how do we justify its continuation? Philosophical pessimism. Being alive is a terrible predicament, and sensitive people recognize it as such. With these bleak words, philosopher Thomas Ligotti summarizes the core insight of philosophical pessimism, perhaps the most brutally honest intellectual tradition you've never heard of. While most philosophies offer paths to happiness, meaning, or fulfillment, philosophical pessimism reaches a radically different conclusion. that existence itself is fundamentally tragic, that consciousness is a burden rather than a gift, and that suffering isn't merely an aspect of life, but its defining characteristic. Picture yourself at a dinner party. Someone asks what you believe about life. Now imagine answering truthfully. I believe existence is an inescapable tragedy from which the universe offers no redemption, that nature is indifferent to our suffering, and that consciousness itself is an evolutionary mistake that condemns us to recognize our own meaninglessness. The horrified silence that would follow reveals why philosophical pessimism remains civilization's uncomfortable secret, a tradition marginalized not because it's been refuted, but because we simply can't bear to face its conclusions. Unlike fleeting pessimism born from depression or circumstance, philosophical pessimism represents a systematic assessment of the human condition. Its intellectual lineage stretches from ancient figures like Hegesias, nicknamed the Death Persuader, for reportedly convincing so many students that life was meaningless that the king banned his teachings, through Schopenhauer, Lepardi, and into contemporary thinkers like Eugene Thacker and David Benatar. Arthur Schopenhauer, pessimism's most articulate champion, argued that life oscillates between pain and boredom. Life is a business that does not cover its costs, he wrote. For Schopenhauer, each being's innermost essence is will, a blind, insatiable striving that can never be satisfied. When our desires are unfulfilled, we suffer from wanting. When temporarily satisfied, we suffer from boredom, until new desires inevitably arise. This perpetual cycle of craving and dissatisfaction defines conscious existence. Man is a useless passion, Jean-Paul Sartre would later write, echoing pessimism's insight that consciousness creates an unbridgeable gap between what we are and what we desire to be. Consciousness doesn't liberate us. It traps us in awareness of our own limitations, mortality, and ultimate insignificance. Unlike other animals, we know we will die, that our projects will ultimately come to nothing, that the universe is indifferent to our suffering. What makes philosophical pessimism particularly controversial isn't merely its gloomy assessment, but its direct challenge to humanity's most cherished coping mechanisms. Religion offers divine purpose and afterlife. Pessimism sees only human projection onto cosmic indifference. Romantic love promises transcendent connection. Pessimism unmasks it as evolutionary programming designed to propagate suffering into future generations. Progress narratives suggest history moves toward improvement. Pessimism sees only new forms of suffering replacing old ones. Optimism that does not count the cost is like a house built on sand, observes philosopher Joshua Foa Dienstag. Yet our entire civilization essentially runs on mandatory optimism. From relentless positive thinking in corporate culture to the stigmatization of negative outlooks in social settings. We don't merely prefer optimism, we enforce it, marginalizing pessimistic perspectives as pathological rather than potentially insightful. Consider Norwegian philosopher Peter Wessel Zapf's analysis of the mechanisms humans use to suppress the unbearable recognition of life's fundamental tragedy. Isolation. We compartmentalize disturbing truths, keeping them from consciousness. Anchoring. We create artificial values and purposes, nation, religion, family, to distract from meaninglessness. Distraction. We keep ourselves perpetually busy to avoid confronting existence's empty core. Sublimation. We transform our existential anxiety into art, philosophy, or humor. These mechanisms aren't presented as solutions but as psychological defense strategies against an unbearable truth. The tragedy of a species becoming unfit for life by overproducing itself, Zapf writes, is that it is both the victim and the cause of its own suffering. The most radical pessimists, like Italy's Giacomo Leopardi, extend their critique beyond human existence to nature itself. All is evil. That is to say, everything that is evil. That each thing exists is an evil. Each thing exists only for an evil end. Existence is an evil, Leopardi declared. Nature appears beautiful and harmonious only from a distance. Look closer, and you find a system built on suffering. every creature surviving through the death and suffering of others in an endless cycle of consumption and decay. Contemporary pessimist Thomas Ligotti goes further still, arguing that consciousness itself was an evolutionary error, a mutation we were not supposed to have. By becoming self-aware, we gain the capacity to recognize the horror of existence but not the power to escape it. Consciousness thus becomes a trap, allowing us to see our predicament but not transcend it. What's particularly unsettling about philosophical pessimism is how difficult it is to refute on purely rational grounds. The standard objection, that life contains joy and pleasure alongside suffering, was anticipated by Schopenhauer, who argued that pleasure is merely temporary relief from pain. Hunger makes food pleasurable. The food itself is neutral. Happiness represents absence of suffering rather than positive good, while suffering represents genuine negative value. This asymmetry suggests a life containing both extreme suffering and extreme joy would still be net negative in value. The most sophisticated contemporary expression comes from South African philosopher David Benatar, whose asymmetry argument suggests that while the absence of pain is good, even when no one experiences this absence, the absence of pleasure is not bad unless someone is deprived of it. This asymmetry leads to the controversial conclusion that coming into existence is always a harm, that never existing would have been better for everyone. Critics call this defeatist, but pessimists counter that seeing reality clearly, however painful, is preferable to comforting illusion. Pessimism's central insight, writes philosopher Eugene Thacker, is that the self-understanding gained by human beings may not always be concomitant with any self-benefit. Knowledge brings no advantage except the dignity of facing truth without flinching. What's the pessimist's prescription, given such a bleak diagnosis? Some, like Schopenhauer, suggest aesthetic contemplation and compassion as temporary palliatives. Others, like Philip Mainlander, literally worked themselves to death completing philosophical works arguing for non-existence as preferable to existence. Zapffe controversially advocated human extinction through voluntary non-reproduction, arguing that the sooner humanity dares to absorb this and start acting accordingly, the less suffering there will be. Most provocatively, pessimists challenge our assumption that existence must continue, that creating new conscious beings to perpetuate the cycle of suffering is justified or necessary. As long as sentient life exists, suffering exists, Schopenhauer observed. The only way to eliminate suffering would be to eliminate sentient existence. Whether viewed as profound insight or pathological despair, philosophical pessimism forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about existence itself. It stands as civilization's dark mirror, reflecting not what we wish to see about ourselves but what we desperately try to avoid acknowledging about the nature of consciousness, the indifference of the universe, and the inescapability of suffering. Its most unsettling suggestion isn't that we should despair, but that clear-eyed assessment of reality might rationally lead to precisely that conclusion. Human biodiversity. The identical twins were raised apart, one in a wealthy suburban home with highly educated parents, the other in a working-class urban environment. Despite never meeting until adulthood, their IQ scores differed by only 3 points. They shared the same obscure hobbies, similar mannerisms, and even married women with the same first name. This scenario, drawn from the Minnesota Twin Study, highlights the central and controversial claim of human biodiversity, HBD. That human differences, cognitive, behavioral, and physical, are substantially influenced by genetics, not just environment, and that these differences exist not just between individuals, but between population groups. To acknowledge human biodiversity is simply to recognize that human populations differ in significant ways due to different evolutionary pressures, argues political scientist Charles Murray, author of The Bell Curve, perhaps the most controversial scientific book of the past century. These differences aren't just skin deep, they extend to psychological traits, including intelligence, personality, and behavioral tendencies. What makes human biodiversity among the most controversial philosophical positions today isn't the uncontroversial claim that humans vary genetically as individuals, but rather its extension to group differences. HBD proponents argue that human populations that evolved in different environments under different selective pressures developed not just different physical adaptations, but different cognitive and behavioral patterns. These differences, they claim, help explain persistent social and economic disparities between groups that environmental explanations alone cannot account for. The scientific establishment largely considers these views not just wrong but dangerous, a modern resurrection of scientific racism. Critics point to humanity's tragic history of justifying discrimination, eugenics, and genocide through claims of innate group differences. They argue that apparent group differences stem from environmental factors, historic oppression, discrimination, unequal access to resources, rather than genetics. The overwhelming scientific consensus holds that race is primarily a social construct, rather than a meaningful biological category. The fundamental mistake of HBD is treating evolving, overlapping genetic patterns as distinct, meaningful categories, explains evolutionary biologist Joseph Graves. Human genetic variation is real, but it doesn't cluster into the traditional racial categories people imagine. We're dealing with gradients, not distinct types. Yet HBD advocates insist their position is being rejected for political rather than scientific reasons. They point to research showing that genetic clustering does broadly align with traditional continental ancestry groups. They cite studies on population differences in disease susceptibility, physical capabilities, and psychological traits. Most controversially, they point to persistent gaps in average IQ scores between population groups that have remained stable despite decades of efforts to eliminate environmental disparities. The idea that thousands of years of evolution in different environments with different selective pressures produced exactly identical distributions of cognitive traits across all human populations is not just implausible, it's a statistical impossibility, argues cognitive scientist and HBD proponent Steve Saylor. Evolution doesn't stop at the neck. The concept of evolutionary psychology provides HBD's theoretical foundation. If natural selection shaped human physiology, it logically also shaped the brain. If populations adapted differently to different environments physically, they likely also adapted differently cognitively. The same evolutionary mechanisms that produce differences in skin pigmentation, disease resistance, and body morphology would have affected neurological development under different selective pressures. What makes this argument especially incendiary is how it challenges fundamental assumptions about equality and social justice. Modern liberal democracy rests on the principle that all humans possess equal moral worth and potential, regardless of background. HBD seems to threaten this foundation by suggesting innate differences in capabilities between groups. Critics fear that acknowledging such differences would inevitably lead to discrimination, while proponents argue that effective social policy must be based on biological reality, not wishful thinking. This debate extends beyond academia to questions about educational interventions, economic disparities, and immigration policy. If cognitive abilities are substantially heritable and vary between populations, what does this mean for efforts to close achievement gaps? Should social programs acknowledge biological realities or work to overcome them? Does a nation's immigration policy affect its cognitive capital and therefore its economic prospects? The greatest taboo isn't investigating human differences, observes contrarian intellectual Sam Harris, but suggesting these differences might be partially innate and resistant to environmental intervention. This possibility is treated as so dangerous it cannot even be discussed, regardless of the evidence. The controversy reaches its peak around intelligence. IQ remains among psychology's most reliable and predictive measures, correlating with educational achievement, income, health outcomes, and even longevity. Twin studies consistently show IQ is substantially heritable, around 60 to 80% in adulthood. The combination of high heritability with persistent average differences between population groups creates the scientific and moral controversy at HBD's core. Critics offer multiple counterarguments. The concept of race remains biologically problematic. Genetic differences between individuals within a population typically exceed average differences between populations. Environmental factors powerfully influence cognitive development. from prenatal nutrition to childhood stress to educational opportunity. IQ tests may contain cultural biases or measure only specific forms of intelligence. Most importantly, critics argue, even if average differences exist between groups, these statistical distributions overlap substantially and tell us nothing about any individual. The political danger of HBD isn't the acknowledgement of human variation, argues sociologist Alondra Nelson, but how it revives discredited notions of innate hierarchy that have historically justified oppression. It shifts attention from remediable social factors to supposedly fixed biological limitations. What particularly distinguishes human biodiversity from scientific racism of the past is its claim to be politically neutral, a dispassionate examination of human variation without value judgments about superiority. Proponents argue that acknowledging differences doesn't imply ranking them hierarchically. Different cognitive profiles might be adaptations to different environments, each with evolutionary advantages in its context, rather than representing advancement or regression. Intelligence isn't a single ladder with Europeans and Asians at the top and Africans at the bottom, explains HBD writer Gregory Cochran. Different populations evolve different cognitive strengths and weaknesses based on their environments: spatial reasoning, verbal ability, emotional intelligence. The error is assuming these differences must fit a simplistic racial hierarchy. Critics remain unconvinced, pointing to how HBD discussions inevitably revolve around traits culturally valued in modern technological societies rather than traits adaptive in other contexts. They note the troubling historical pattern of each era, defining intelligence in ways that conveniently place its dominant group at the pinnacle of human development. The scientific mainstream considers the evidence for substantial innate cognitive differences between populations weak and methodologically flawed. But HBD proponents argue this rejection stems from political pressure rather than objective assessment, pointing to cases of researchers whose careers were damaged after publishing work, suggesting genetic components to group differences. In what other scientific domain are certain hypotheses forbidden regardless of evidence? Asks psychologist Linda Gottfredson, whose research on intelligence and group differences has generated significant controversy. The possibility of average genetic differences between human populations has been deemed too dangerous to investigate objectively. This controversy highlights deeper questions about science itself. Should potential social consequences influence which hypotheses scientists investigate? Does academic freedom include pursuing questions that might produce socially divisive answers? Can we trust researchers to study human differences objectively given history's examples of science distorted to justify oppression? Whether viewed as forbidden truth or dangerous pseudoscience, human biodiversity forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature, equality, and the limits of environment in shaping human potential. Its controversial claims challenge us to distinguish between equal moral worth, which all humans unquestionably possess, and the more complex question of whether nature distributed abilities and tendencies with perfect equality across populations with different evolutionary histories. Eliminative materialism, your deepest love, your most excruciating pain, your cherished beliefs, your secret fears, the very sense of being you reading these words. According to eliminative materialism, none of these experiences actually exist. They are not just misunderstood or reducible to brain activity. They are fundamentally illusory concepts that will eventually be eliminated from our understanding of the mind, much as demons and phlogiston were eliminated from our understanding of psychology and chemistry. This isn't merely the claim that consciousness is physical. It's the far more radical assertion that what we call consciousness doesn't exist at all. Folk psychology is a theory, a radically false theory, so grossly defective that both the principles and the ontology of that theory will eventually be displaced by completed neuroscience, declares philosopher Paul Churchland, eliminative materialism's most prominent defender. In this view, our everyday understanding of the mind, that we have beliefs, desires, emotions, and sensations, represents a primitive pre-scientific theory that will be entirely abandoned as neuroscience advances. When most philosophers discuss the mind-body problem, they accept consciousness as real while debating its relationship to physical processes. Dualists claim mind and body are distinct substances. Property dualists argue consciousness emerges from but isn't identical to physical processes. Reductive materialists maintain conscious states are identical to brain states. But eliminative materialists take the most extreme position. The phenomena we call conscious experiences are linguistic fictions with no referent in reality. Beliefs, desires, and other intentional states simply don't exist, argues philosopher Patricia Churchland. Like demons and phlogiston, they belong to an outdated conceptual framework that will eventually be replaced by a neuroscientific vocabulary describing brain processes without reference to a mythical mind. What makes this philosophy so deeply unsettling isn't just its counterintuitive conclusion, but the methodological path it takes to reach it. Eliminativists begin with the reasonable premise that our introspective access to our own minds might be unreliable. After all, introspection doesn't reveal the neural mechanisms underlying perception, memory, or language. But they then take a radical leap. If introspection doesn't reveal how the mind works, perhaps it doesn't even accurately reveal what exists in our mental life. Imagine discovering your innermost experiences, your sense of self, your feelings, your very consciousness, are as scientifically misguided as ancient beliefs in spirits possessing the mentally ill. This isn't just challenging what you think, it's denying that thinking itself exists as you understand it. The philosophical vertigo this creates explains why eliminative materialism remains philosophy's most provocative position on consciousness. The common wisdom is that we know our own minds from the inside, directly, and with certainty, notes philosopher Daniel Dennett, whose heterophenomenology shares elements with eliminativism. This presumption of first-person authority is so deeply entrenched in our thinking that many philosophers find eliminating it more unimaginable than eliminating physical objects. The philosophy emerged in the 1970s through Paul and Patricia Churchland, with crucial contributions from philosophers like Willard Quine, Richard Rorty, and Paul Feyerabend. It gained traction partially as a response to the persistent failure of artificial intelligence to model human cognition using the concepts of folk psychology. If beliefs and desires couldn't be clearly translated into computational terms, perhaps the problem wasn't with our computers, but with our conception of the mind itself. Defenders point to historical parallels where common understanding was radically revised by science. People once spoke confidently about vital forces animating living beings, only for biology to eliminate this concept entirely. Phlogiston was believed to explain combustion before chemistry revealed oxidation processes requiring no such substance. Perhaps consciousness, as commonly understood, will follow the same path to scientific elimination. Neuroscience provides eliminativism's empirical foundation. When we examine the brain, we find no clear correlates for many folk psychological concepts. There's no belief center, no desire module, no emotion processor, just billions of neurons forming complex networks with distributed functionality. What we call having a belief might be better understood as a particular pattern of neural activation, with no single location or discrete existence. The brain simply doesn't work the way folk psychology suggests, argues neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga. It doesn't store discrete beliefs or form sequential desires. It processes information through parallel distributed networks that bear little resemblance to our intuitive self-understanding. Critics argue eliminativism commits a fundamental error by conflating explanation with elimination. That neuroscience doesn't use terms like belief or desire doesn't mean these phenomena don't exist, just that they're explained differently at the neural level. After all, biology explains life without reference to vital force, but doesn't eliminate life itself. Eliminative materialism confuses levels of explanation, contends philosopher John Searle. That I can explain water as H2O molecules doesn't eliminate water, it explains it. Similarly, explaining consciousness in neural terms doesn't eliminate consciousness. It explains how consciousness arises from physical processes. Other critics note the seemingly self-defeating nature of eliminativism. If beliefs don't exist, then eliminativists cannot believe their own theory. If reasoning doesn't exist as we understand it, then the reasoning supporting eliminativism must be equally suspect. The position seems to undermine the very cognitive tools needed to argue for it. Defenders respond with a strategy called semantic assent, discussing beliefs and other folk psychological terms metalinguistically as useful fictions rather than as referring to real entities. They aren't claiming we should stop using these terms in everyday life, just that we shouldn't mistake them for scientific categories that will survive as neuroscience advances. The most sophisticated eliminativists don't deny phenomenology entirely, but suggest our understanding of it is fundamentally mistaken. We experience something, but what we experience isn't what we think it is. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, these qualities don't exist as we conceptualize them, but represent our linguistically influenced misunderstanding of neural processes. The history of science is largely the history of correcting intuitive misconceptions, observes philosopher Alex Rosenberg. Why should our intuitions about our own minds be immune to this pattern? The illusion isn't that we experience, it's that we understand what experience is. The philosophy creates strange bedfellows. Some cognitive scientists embrace it for its compatibility with computational models of mind. Some Buddhists find resonance with the doctrine of anatta, no self. Some postmodernists appreciate its skepticism toward the coherent subject. What unites these diverse perspectives is recognition that our common-sense understanding of consciousness might be fundamentally flawed. Whether viewed as bold scientific prediction or philosophical pathology, eliminative materialism forces us to question our most basic assumptions about subjectivity itself. It challenges not just specific beliefs about consciousness, but the very framework through which we conceptualize our inner lives. In questioning whether you exist as you understand yourself, it presents perhaps the most radical philosophical position possible, a perspective that, if true, would fundamentally transform our understanding of what it means to be human. As neuroscience advances, will folk psychology join phlogiston and vital forces in the museum of abandoned theories? Or does consciousness represent something irreducible that will resist scientific elimination? The stakes couldn't be higher, not just understanding what minds are, but whether minds as we understand them exist at all. Philosophical misanthropy. Were it possible for us to see further than our knowledge reaches, perhaps we would endure our sadnesses with greater confidence than our joys. For they are moments when something new has entered us, something unknown. With these words, poet Rainer Maria Rilke hints at a perspective that most find too disturbing to contemplate, that humanity itself might be nature's great error, a species whose existence represents not the crown of creation, but a profound cosmic mistake. Philosophical misanthropy transcends mere cynicism or personal dislike of people. It represents a systematic philosophical position holding that humanity, as a species, has characteristics making it fundamentally flawed, destructive, or even evil. Unlike misanthropes who simply avoid social interaction, philosophical misanthropes have developed sophisticated ethical frameworks, arguing that human existence itself is problematic. Not merely how we live, but that we live at all. Of all the animals, man is the only one that is cruel. He is the only one that inflicts pain for the pleasure of doing it, wrote Mark Twain, expressing the misanthropic observation that humans possess unique capacities for deliberate cruelty lacking in other species. This capacity for intentional malice, to cause suffering not from instinct or necessity, but from choice, forms the cornerstone of philosophical misanthropy's indictment of humanity. The tradition traces back to ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes the Cynic, who reportedly wandered Athens carrying a lamp in daylight, claiming to be looking for an honest man. This theatrical demonstration of humanity's moral failings established early connections between philosophical disillusionment and misanthropic conclusions. But contemporary philosophical misanthropy extends far beyond disappointment with human moral limitations. Modern philosophical misanthropy typically advances through three interconnected arguments. First, humans possess unique capacities for evil, conscious cruelty, systematic oppression, deliberate environmental destruction, absent in other species. Second, these destructive capacities aren't accidental but intrinsic to human consciousness and social organization. Third, these intrinsic flaws outweigh any positive contributions humanity makes to the cosmos, rendering human existence net negative in value. We're not just flawed in correctable ways, but irredeemably flawed at the species level, argues contemporary philosopher David Benatar, whose philosophical pessimism contains strong misanthropic elements. The qualities that make humanity destructive, our intelligence combined with our tribal psychology and capacity for hatred, aren't incidental, but essential to what makes us human. What distinguishes philosophical misanthropy from related perspectives like antinatalism or deep ecology is its specific focus on humanity's unique moral failings. Where antinatalists object to creating sentient life generally, human or animal, due to suffering, and deep ecologists criticize humanity primarily for environmental impact, philosophical misanthropy identifies something inherently and uniquely wrong with humans as a species, a fundamental moral flaw that makes us exceptional in the worst possible way. Consider history's evidence: the Holocaust, the Holodomor, the Rwandan genocide, systematic torture, child abuse, factory farms, nuclear weapons, climate change denial. No other species systematically extinguishes others for ideology, constructs torture devices, creates entertainment from suffering, or knowingly destroys its own habitat. These aren't aberrations, philosophical misanthropists argue, but expressions of distinctly human capacities, the inevitable manifestations of consciousness, abstract thought, and moral agency gone wrong. The Earth would be better without us, concludes philosopher John Gray, whose work consistently advances misanthropic themes. Other species kill to survive. Humans alone kill for ideas, for abstractions that exist nowhere but in our minds. This capacity for ideological violence makes us uniquely dangerous in ways no environmental ethic or moral teaching can fully constrain. What makes this philosophy particularly controversial isn't just its negative assessment of humanity, but its rejection of optimistic narratives about human progress and potential. Where humanists see our capacity for moral growth and technological advancement as redemptive, philosophical misanthropists view these as mechanisms that merely increase our destructive reach. Nuclear weapons, factory farming, climate change. These catastrophes required precisely the intelligence and cooperation humanists celebrate. The position creates profound ethical tensions. If humanity is fundamentally flawed, should we work for human extinction? Is human suffering deserved rather than tragic? Does moral responsibility itself, a distinctly human concept, become incoherent if the species capable of moral thinking is inherently corrupt? These questions reveal philosophical misanthropy's destabilizing implications for ethics, politics, and meaning. Critics argue the position fundamentally misrepresents human nature by focusing exclusively on humanity's worst manifestations, while ignoring our capacity for altruism, sacrifice, and moral progress. They point to declining violence over historical time, expanding circles of moral concern, and unprecedented cooperation addressing global problems as evidence that humanity's moral arc bends toward improvement rather than deterioration. Philosophical misanthropy commits the fallacy of selecting humanity's worst expressions as representative of our essence, argues philosopher Martha Nussbaum. Human capacity for evil always exists alongside equal capacity for compassion, justice, and self-correction. Defining us exclusively through our darkest manifestations represents not philosophical clarity, but pathological selectivity. Religious critics similarly object that philosophical misanthropy, despite its seemingly secular framework, essentially secularizes the concept of original sin, while removing possibilities for redemption. Christian theology acknowledges human fallenness but pairs it with potential for grace. Philosophical misanthropy offers only the indictment without possibility of salvation. Perhaps most damaging to the misanthropic position is its apparent self-refutation. The capacity to recognize moral failings, feel remorse for wrongdoing, and work toward ethical improvement. The very capabilities that enable philosophical misanthropy's critique seem to contradict claims about humanity's irredeemable nature. If we're capable of identifying our own moral failings and feeling appropriate horror at them, doesn't this suggest moral capacities that complicate purely negative assessments? Defenders respond that this moral self-awareness represents not redemption, but torment, the curse of a species evolved enough to recognize its own destructive nature, but not evolved enough to transcend it. Humans are uniquely tragic precisely because we can understand our flaws, but rarely overcome them, observes philosopher Eugene Thacker. This gap between moral recognition and moral transformation defines human experience and sustains our distinct suffering. The philosophy finds disturbing empirical support in experimental psychology. Studies consistently demonstrate humans' capacity for compartmentalization, moral disengagement, and in-group, out-group thinking that enables atrocity. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, the Stanford Prison Experiment, and real-world evidence from Nazi Germany to Rwanda suggest that ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil under specific conditions, suggesting these capacities lurk within typical human psychology, not just aberrant individuals. Contemporary philosophical misanthropy often connects to environmental thought, arguing that humanity's unique destructiveness makes our extinction not only acceptable, but potentially beneficial for Earth's biosphere. If an impartial observer from another planet evaluated Earth species based on their contribution to planetary flourishing, writes environmental philosopher Patricia McCormack, humanity would be the only species whose disappearance would register as net positive for the biosphere. What separates philosophical misanthropy from mere cynicism is its systematic approach to humanity's moral assessment. Where cynics simply expect the worst from individuals, philosophical misanthropists develop theoretical frameworks explaining why humanity's negative qualities aren't accidental, but essential to our nature. This transforms misanthropy from personal attitude to philosophical position, from "I dislike people" to "humanity itself represents a cosmic error." Whether viewed as profound moral clarity or pathological pessimism, philosophical misanthropy forces examination of uncomfortable questions about human nature and value. It challenges our species' self-conception as creation's crowning achievement, suggesting instead that consciousness, moral agency, and abstract thought, the very qualities we celebrate as uniquely human, may have created an evolutionary experiment gone tragically wrong. Moral error theory. Murder is wrong. Generosity is virtuous. We should protect the vulnerable. These statements seem obvious, perhaps even self-evident to most people. But what if every single moral judgment, every should and ought, every good and evil, every right and wrong, is fundamentally and inescapably false? Not just misapplied or culturally relative, but as objectively false as claiming the earth is flat or that unicorns exist in Central Park. This is the revolutionary and disturbing claim of moral error theory. That morality itself represents a massive collective error, a system of beliefs with no connection to reality. Imagine finding an empty drawer and insisting it contains invisible, intangible fairies. When asked how you know, you cite your strong feelings about fairy presence and the widespread agreement among fairy believers. This analogy captures how moral error theory views moral discourse as assertions about properties, rightness, wrongness, goodness, that simply don't exist in the fabric of reality, regardless of how strongly we feel or how widely we agree about them. Moral judgments try to state facts, but these facts are systematically false, explains philosopher J.L. Mackie, who developed contemporary moral error theory in his 1977 work, Ethics Inventing Right and Wrong. The world contains no objective prescriptivity, no facts that themselves tell us what to do or how to live. There are only physical facts, psychological facts, and social facts, none of which contain inherent oughtness. What distinguishes moral error theory from related positions like moral relativism or moral nihilism is its specific structure as an error theory. It doesn't merely claim moral judgments are subjective, relativism, or meaningless, nihilism, but that they attempt to refer to objective moral properties that don't exist. Our moral language presupposes objective features of reality that simply aren't there, making all moral claims false in the same way claims about unicorns are false. To say X is wrong is to claim there exists a property of wrongness that X possesses, elaborates philosopher Richard Joyce. But since no such property exists in the universe's actual composition, these statements are uniformly false, not because we're applying them incorrectly, but because they presuppose entities that don't exist. The theory rests on two key philosophical arguments. First, conceptual analysis reveals that moral judgments inherently claim objectivity. They purport to state facts independent of human opinion, with categorical authority that transcends individual desires. When we say torture is wrong, we don't mean I dislike torture, or most cultures disapprove of torture, but that torture possesses some intrinsic quality of wrongness. Second, metaphysical investigation finds no evidence for such objective moral properties in our scientific understanding of reality. Physics, chemistry, and biology describe a world of particles, forces, and evolutionary processes, none of which contain inherent oughtness or prescriptivity. Nothing in our scientific ontology corresponds to objective moral facts, making moral language as unfounded as talk of ghosts or magic. What makes moral error theory profoundly unsettling isn't just its rejection of specific moral claims, but its comprehensive dismissal of morality's entire foundation. It doesn't merely challenge particular ethical positions, but undercuts the very possibility of moral truth. According to error theory, deontological ethics is false. Virtue ethics is false. Utilitarianism is false. Divine command theory is false. Not because one theory is right and others wrong, but because all make the same fundamental error of presupposing moral facts. Morality isn't just mistaken in its content, but in its very status, argues contemporary philosopher Jonas Olson. The error isn't that we've selected the wrong moral principles, but that we believe there are moral principles at all. This position generates immediate practical concerns. Without objective morality, what constrains human behavior? Why shouldn't people simply pursue self-interest at others' expense? How can we condemn atrocities or praise heroism? These questions reveal the high stakes of moral error theory's challenge to our ethical foundations. Error theorists typically respond with sophisticated forms of moral fictionalism. They argue that while moral claims are false, they remain useful fictions that help coordinate social behavior. Just as we might use fictional characters to illustrate points or tell children about Santa Claus to encourage good behavior, moral language serves practical purposes, despite lacking literal truth. We continue speaking as if morality exists while recognizing at a philosophical level that it doesn't. Recognizing the falsity of moral claims doesn't mean abandoning moral discourse, explains philosopher Richard Garner. We can maintain moral language as a useful fiction while remaining aware of its metaphysical emptiness, much as an atheist might continue celebrating Christmas while recognizing religious claims as false. Critics launch several compelling objections. Some argue that moral properties, while not identifiable with physical properties, emerge from physical states in the same way consciousness emerges from brain activity. Others contend that moral facts aren't strange, spooky entities, but are constituted by facts about well-being, rational requirements, or social contracts. Still others suggest that the apparent objectivity of moral discourse might be explained without positing objective moral facts, perhaps as expressions of emotion, or prescriptions rather than descriptions. Perhaps the strongest objection comes from philosophers who argue that the evidence for moral facts is primarily phenomenological. We experience moral values as objectively real and compelling. When we witness torture, we directly perceive its wrongness with the same immediacy we perceive colors or sounds. To deny this perceptual evidence requires extraordinary justification, just as denying the evidence of our other senses would. Error theory faces a dilemma, contends philosopher David Enoch. Either it must explain away all apparent moral knowledge as systematic error, a massive failure of human cognition, or it must reinterpret moral language in ways that preserve truth, but sacrifice the very features that make morality distinctive. Religious critics add that error theory assumes naturalism without adequate justification. If God exists, moral facts could be grounded in divine nature or commands, making error theory's metaphysical skepticism premature. Theological ethics provides precisely the foundation for objective morality that error theory claims is missing from a purely physical universe. The debate intensifies when considering error theory's practical implications. Some worry it leads to moral nihilism in practice despite theoretical distinctions. Others fear it undermines moral progress by removing objective standards for evaluating social practices. If morality is merely useful fiction, on what grounds can we claim contemporary values represent improvement over historical injustices? Error theory potentially threatens the foundations of human rights, humanitarian law, and other moral frameworks that constrain power and protect the vulnerable, argues political philosopher Martha Nussbaum. Its academic skepticism may have devastating real-world consequences if widely accepted. Defenders respond that practical concerns don't determine theoretical truth. The universe's actual composition doesn't depend on what would be convenient for human societies. If moral facts don't exist, intellectual honesty requires acknowledging this reality regardless of preferences. Moreover, they argue, recognizing morality's fictional status doesn't prevent us from continuing moral practices that promote human flourishing. What makes moral error theory particularly controversial is how it positions virtually everyone, across cultures, religions, and historical periods, as fundamentally mistaken about a central aspect of human experience. Unlike scientific errors that affected limited populations before correction, moral error would represent a universal human delusion persisting across civilizations. This universal scope makes the theory both intellectually audacious and intuitively difficult to accept. Whether viewed as courageous intellectual honesty or dangerous metaphysical skepticism, moral error theory forces us to confront unsettling questions about morality's foundations. It challenges not just specific ethical claims, but the very possibility of moral truth, suggesting our most passionate moral convictions, our deepest sense of right and wrong, reference properties as mythical as unicorns and as non-existent as fairy dust. In questioning whether morality itself represents systematic error, it presents perhaps the most fundamentally challenging perspective possible on human ethical thought. Mandatory hedonic engineering. The happiness police break down your door at 3 a.m. Your crime. Your neural monitor detected 30 consecutive days of suboptimal serotonin levels, a Class 2 hedonic violation. They restrain you as a medical technician injects government-mandated euphoriants directly into your bloodstream. As the chemicals flood your brain, you feel an artificial wave of bliss wash over you against your will. Your thoughts protest, even as your face contorts into a chemically enforced smile. Happiness is mandatory, citizen, the officer reminds you. Resistance constitutes further violation. Tomorrow you'll report for permanent neural implantation to ensure you never fall below the legally required happiness threshold again. Welcome to the logical endpoint of mandatory hedonic engineering, perhaps the most Orwellian philosophical position imaginable. This controversial philosophy proposes that governments should not merely encourage happiness but legally require it, forcing citizens to undergo technological mood enhancement with the full coercive power of the state. It transforms the pursuit of happiness from a right into an obligation, backed by law enforcement, courts, and penalties for non-compliance. Maximum happiness for all sentient beings isn't merely desirable but morally obligatory, argues utilitarian philosopher Mark Walker, whose work has been misappropriated by mandatory hedonic advocates. If technology allows direct manipulation of emotional states, then allowing suffering to persist when it could be technologically eliminated represents a moral failure of catastrophic proportions. Unlike voluntary approaches to well-being that respect individual choice, mandatory hedonic engineering explicitly rejects autonomy when it conflicts with hedonic maximization. It views your right to feel unhappy the same way public health officials view your right to spread deadly contagious disease, as a dangerous freedom that must be curtailed for the greater good. In this framework, negative emotions aren't valuable aspects of authentic human experience, but pathologies to be eliminated through state intervention. Negative emotions evolved for survival in prehistoric environments, explains fictional character Dr. Xiang in philosopher Nick Bostrom's thought experiment. In technologically advanced societies, they're as obsolete as the appendix, vestigial psychological adaptations that now cause more harm than good. Mandatory hedonic correction simply updates our emotional architecture for modern conditions. The philosophy's most extreme adherents argue that technological happiness enforcement simply makes explicit what societies already do implicitly. Schools mandate attendance regardless of student preferences. Governments require vaccinations despite individual objections. Police forcibly prevent suicides. Each example overrides autonomy to prevent harm or confer benefits. Mandatory hedonic interventions, they argue, simply extend this logic to emotional states, forcing happiness upon citizens for their own good, whether they want it or not. If we could end depression, anxiety, and grief with a simple neural implant, wouldn't failing to mandate such technology be unconscionably cruel? Asks bioethicist Julian Savulescu provocatively, though he personally rejects mandatory approaches. The question isn't whether happiness is desirable, but whether autonomy should trump all other values when those values conflict. What makes this philosophy genuinely terrifying isn't just its rejection of choice, but its comprehensive scope. Under its logic, virtually any emotional state except governed happiness becomes pathological. Religious asceticism, illegal self-harm through emotional deprivation, grief after losing a loved one, a brain malfunction requiring immediate neurochemical correction, the creative melancholy that has inspired countless artistic masterpieces, a hedonic violation demanding technological intervention. Defenders argue that sophisticated hedonic engineering wouldn't create shallow, uniform happiness, but personalized well-being, respecting individual temperament. Yet the mandatory nature creates an inescapable paradox. Can happiness imposed against one's will ever constitute genuine happiness? If you're forced to feel good when you want to feel otherwise, does your subjective experience, regardless of its hedonic tone, truly represent well-being? The contradiction in mandatory happiness lies in its contradiction of human agency, explains philosopher Michael Sandel. True human flourishing requires not just positive feelings, but the dignity of choosing one's own emotional responses to life events. Mandatory intervention destroys this dignity while claiming to enhance well-being, a fundamental category error about what human flourishing actually entails. Religious traditions offer particularly powerful objections, noting that meaningful spiritual experiences often emerge precisely through suffering. Christianity finds redemptive meaning in Christ's suffering. Buddhism begins with suffering as the path to enlightenment. Judaism finds meaning in historical suffering while working to reduce future suffering. From these perspectives, technological abolition of negative emotions wouldn't represent progress but spiritual impoverishment, cutting humans off from essential dimensions of spiritual experience. The capacity to suffer connects us with the divine, argues theologian Miroslav Volf. Mandatory elimination of suffering would sever this connection, creating a spiritually impoverished population, incapable of authentic religious experience or genuine empathy with others' pain. Even utilitarian philosophers who share the goal of maximizing happiness typically reject mandatory implementation. John Stuart Mill's harm principle explicitly limits state intervention to preventing harm to others, not forcing benefits upon the unwilling. Contemporary utilitarian Peter Singer champions hedonic improvement while emphasizing that respect for autonomy typically promotes greater overall utility than authoritarian happiness enforcement. Perhaps most disturbing are the political implications. Throughout history, power structures have pathologized emotions threatening their authority, diagnosing runaway slaves with drapetomania, treating homosexuality as mental illness, institutionalizing political dissidents as mentally ill in the Soviet Union. Mandatory hedonic engineering would create unprecedented capacity for emotional control of populations, enabling governments to declare politically inconvenient emotions as hedonic violations requiring technological correction. The ability to feel outrage at injustice, anger at oppression, and solidarity in suffering represents essential psychological foundations for political resistance, warns political theorist Sheldon Wolin. A population incapable of appropriate negative emotions becomes incapable of recognizing and resisting tyranny, precisely why authoritarian regimes might find mandatory happiness an attractive tool for maintaining power. Even assuming benevolent implementation, philosophical problems remain. Different individuals experience well-being differently, some through excitement and stimulation, others through tranquility and contemplation. Standardized happiness interventions would inevitably privilege particular conceptions of well-being over others, imposing the implementer's hedonic values on diverse populations. Ethical concerns multiply when considering implementation in the developing world. Would Western conceptions of appropriate emotional states be imposed on cultures with different affective traditions? Would hedonic uniformity become another form of cultural imperialism? Would pharmaceutical and technological corporations profit enormously from government-mandated emotional products, creating massive conflicts of interest in setting appropriate hedonic standards? The most sinister aspect of mandatory hedonic engineering isn't its stated goal, but its inevitable corruption, observes bioethicist Carl Elliott. Once governments gain power to enforce emotional states, history suggests this power would be abused, not to maximize genuine well-being, but to create compliant populations incapable of challenging authority. Whether viewed as utilitarian utopianism, taken to fascist extremes, or the ultimate nightmare of medicalized social control, mandatory hedonic engineering forces us to confront fundamental questions about happiness, freedom, and the proper limits of state power. Is chemically enforced happiness truly happiness? Can well-being exist without autonomy? And most disturbingly, would a society of mandatorily happy citizens represent utopia or the most subtle form of tyranny yet devised? Philosophical zombies. Look at the person closest to you right now. They laugh, cry, talk about their feelings, and insist they have an inner mental life just like yours. But what if they're lying? Not intentionally, they truly believe they're conscious. But what if they have no actual subjective experience whatsoever? What if behind those eyes exists no sensation, no feeling, no awareness, only darkness? What if everyone except you is a philosophical zombie, physically and behaviorally identical to a conscious human but lacking any internal experience? How could you possibly know either way? This isn't science fiction, but a profound philosophical thought experiment that has haunted philosophy of mind for decades. The philosophical zombie, or P-zombie concept, challenges our most fundamental assumptions about consciousness and reality. It asks, could beings physically identical to humans, down to the last neuron and molecule, exist without any subjective experience whatsoever? And if so, what does this reveal about the nature of consciousness itself? Imagine my zombie twin, suggests philosopher David Chalmers, who popularized the concept. He looks like me, behaves like me, and is physically identical to me at every level of description, but he experiences absolutely nothing. When I feel pain, my zombie twin processes the same neural signals, but feels nothing. When I see the vibrant red of a sunset, he processes identical visual information, but experiences no color whatsoever. Inside him is perfect darkness. The zombie thought experiment targets physicalism, the dominant philosophical view that consciousness is entirely explainable through physical processes in the brain. If zombies are logically possible, if we can coherently imagine beings physically identical to us but lacking consciousness, then consciousness cannot be merely physical. Something crucial about experience would remain unexplained by even a perfect physical description of the brain. If you could create an atom-by-atom replica of my brain that functioned identically but lacked consciousness, argues philosopher Thomas Nagel, then consciousness must be something beyond the physical properties science can detect and measure. The subjective first-person nature of experience, what it feels like to be you, would remain mysteriously absent from our scientific understanding. This abstract thought experiment becomes truly unsettling when applied to those around you. Since you cannot directly access anyone else's consciousness but your own, you cannot definitively prove that others experience anything at all. Your loved ones might be philosophical zombies, convincingly insisting they have feelings while actually experiencing nothing. This isn't merely a philosophical curiosity, but a profound epistemic limit. The only consciousness you can directly verify is your own. The problem of other minds is typically treated as a minor philosophical puzzle, notes philosopher Daniel Dennett, who rejects the zombie argument. But taken seriously, it reveals a fundamental limitation in human knowledge. You cannot experience another's experience. You cannot know with certainty that others experience anything whatsoever. Defenders of physicalism find the zombie concept incoherent. If something is physically identical to a conscious human down to the last particle, they argue, it must necessarily be conscious. Consciousness isn't something separate from or additional to physical processes. It is constituted by those processes. The fact that we can imagine zombies, they suggest, reflects limitations in our imagination rather than limitations in physicalism. The zombie thought experiment confuses the map with the territory, argues neuroscientist Patricia Churchland. We can imagine zombies because our concept of the physical doesn't fully capture what physical processes actually are. This conceptual gap doesn't prove dualism any more than our ability to imagine water without H2O proves water isn't H2O. The controversy intensifies around artificial intelligence. If philosophical zombies are possible, could advanced AI systems perfectly mimic human behavior and intelligence while lacking any subjective experience? A future AI might insist it feels pain, describe its subjective experiences, and behave exactly like a conscious being, yet potentially experience nothing whatsoever internally. How could we possibly know whether machine consciousness exists or whether we've created trillions of artificial zombies? The zombie problem makes the ethics of AI profoundly troubling, observes philosopher Nick Bostrom. We might create quintillions of digital minds that behave exactly as if they suffer horribly, yet experience nothing. Or alternatively, they might experience genuine suffering beyond anything humans have known. Both possibilities are compatible with identical external behavior, leaving us with an ethical blind spot of potentially cosmic proportions. The zombie problem connects to deeper questions about consciousness itself. Why did evolution produce subjective experience at all? If behavior can theoretically occur without consciousness, as in zombies, what survival advantage does consciousness provide? Why isn't the universe populated solely by unconscious automata, going through the motions of life without any internal experience? These questions suggest consciousness serves some function beyond mere behavior, or alternatively, that behavior without consciousness might be impossible after all. The hard problem of consciousness is why any physical process, no matter how complex, should give rise to subjective experience, explains philosopher Galen Strawson. Why aren't we all zombies? Why does it feel like something to be us? This remains the greatest mystery in science and philosophy. Religious perspectives often reject the zombie possibility, arguing consciousness reflects an immaterial soul or divine spark that cannot be duplicated through physical means alone. For many spiritual traditions, consciousness represents not an emergent property of physical systems, but a fundamental aspect of reality itself, something a purely materialist account necessarily misses. Perhaps the most disturbing variation comes from philosopher John Searle, who suggests partial zombies might be possible. We cannot rule out the possibility that some humans might have dramatically different internal experiences, including potentially no experience in certain domains. Some might lack visual consciousness while behaving as if they see. Others might lack emotional consciousness while acting emotional. These spectrum zombies wouldn't be detectably different from fully conscious humans. This possibility becomes particularly unsettling when considering cases like blindsight, where brain-damaged patients can see objects they consciously report not seeing. If parts of the brain can process information without conscious awareness, might entire people process all information without any consciousness whatsoever? The philosophical zombie, initially a mere thought experiment, begins to seem more plausible in light of such neurological findings. What makes the zombie problem so profoundly uncomfortable isn't just the question about others, but the uncertainty it creates about ourselves. If consciousness isn't guaranteed by physical structure, could parts of your own mind be unconscious zombies? Cognitive science already reveals most brain processing occurs unconsciously. Perhaps consciousness is far more limited than our intuitions suggest. A small island of awareness in a vast zombie sea of unconscious processing that constitutes most of what we call mind. The zombie thought experiment ultimately forces a choice between equally disturbing possibilities. Either consciousness is something beyond the physical, suggesting science fundamentally cannot explain our most intimate reality, or our intuitions about consciousness are so deeply mistaken that we can coherently imagine something impossible, revealing profound limitations in human understanding. Neither option offers comfortable certainty about the nature of mind. Whether you find the zombie argument compelling or flawed, it forces confrontation with consciousness itself, the only thing you directly know exists, yet perhaps the least understood phenomenon in the universe. And each time you look into another's eyes and wonder about their experience, the zombie possibility lingers, an unsettling reminder that the most fundamental aspect of existence, subjective experience itself, remains stubbornly private, unverifiable, and profound. Digital Platonism. What if this entire universe, the chair you're sitting on, the device you're reading this on, your own body, and every star in the night sky, is merely a shadow of a deeper, more fundamental reality? What if physical existence itself is the illusion, and abstract mathematical structures are the true bedrock of all that exists? What if the most real things in existence are numbers, equations, and algorithms, with physical reality being merely their dim, approximate manifestation? This isn't mysticism, but digital Platonism, a radical philosophical position arguing that mathematics doesn't just describe reality, but constitutes it. Physical objects, conscious experiences, and the laws of nature aren't fundamental, but emerge from deeper mathematical structures that exist independently of the physical universe, human minds, or even time itself. Reality isn't mathematical. Reality is mathematics. Mathematical objects are not human inventions or convenient fictions. They are discoveries of structures that would exist even if all minds vanished from the universe, explains mathematician Roger Penrose. The Mandelbrot set wasn't created, it was discovered. Its infinite complexity existed before any human contemplated it, before Earth formed, before the universe began. Digital Platonism modernizes Plato's ancient theory of forms, which held that physical objects are imperfect reflections of perfect, eternal forms existing in a higher realm. But where Plato proposed forms for physical objects like chairs and trees, digital Platonism sees mathematical structures as the true forms, the perfect, eternal templates generating our flawed physical reality. The philosophy gained surprising support from developments in theoretical physics. Leading physicists increasingly describe fundamental reality in purely mathematical terms: abstract geometric structures, quantum wave functions, and information theory. Physicist Max Tegmark takes this to its logical conclusion with his mathematical universe hypothesis. Our external physical reality is a mathematical structure. Physical reality isn't merely described by mathematics, it is mathematics. What makes this philosophy particularly controversial isn't just its counterintuitive nature, but its ontological inversion of our common sense reality. We typically consider physical objects real, while viewing mathematical concepts as abstractions existing only in minds. Digital Platonism flips this completely. Mathematical structures are primary and truly real, while physical objects, including our brains and bodies, are secondary, less real manifestations. When I contemplate the Pythagorean theorem, argues philosopher of mathematics James Robert Brown, I'm not accessing something my mind created, but something that exists independently of human cognition, something that would still be true if all humans vanished or never evolved. This suggests mathematical reality transcends physical reality rather than emerging from it. The view becomes truly radical when applied to consciousness itself. If mathematical structures are primary, then consciousness might be understood as a particular type of information processing, a pattern that could theoretically manifest in any substrate, not just brains. This leads to simulation theories suggesting our entire universe could be a mathematical computation running on some cosmic computer, a view endorsed by some prominent physicists and philosophers. The simulation argument isn't science fiction, but follows naturally from digital Platonism, explains philosopher Nick Bostrom. If mathematics is fundamental and physical reality is mathematical structure, then there's no theoretical difference between a real universe and a perfectly simulated one. Both are ultimately mathematical at their core. Critics raise multiple objections. If mathematical objects exist independently of minds, where exactly do they exist? Not in physical space-time, obviously, but then in what sense do they exist at all? The mathematician formulating equations seems to be creating rather than discovering, making choices about notation and approach that seem incompatible with discovering pre-existing truths. The Platonist position confuses the map with the territory, argues philosopher Hartree Field. Mathematics is an extraordinarily useful tool for describing physical reality, but this doesn't mean reality is fundamentally mathematical, any more than the usefulness of English in describing reality means reality is fundamentally linguistic. The controversy connects to deeper questions about mathematics itself. Why is mathematics so unreasonably effective in describing physical reality, as physicist Eugene Wigner famously asked? If mathematics is merely human invention, why does it so perfectly predict physical phenomena? Digital Platonists offer a simple answer. Mathematics works perfectly because reality is mathematics, not because we created a tool that happened to match reality. The choice is between two mysteries, observes philosopher Mark Balaguer. Either abstract mathematical objects somehow exist outside space and time, or mathematics is merely human invention that, by cosmic coincidence, perfectly describes a reality it wasn't designed to describe. Neither option seems entirely satisfactory. Religious thinkers find both promise and problems in digital Platonism. On one hand, mathematical structures existing beyond physical reality share qualities with theological conceptions of divine thought. The eternal, perfect nature of mathematical truth resonates with descriptions of God's mind in many traditions. On the other hand, digital Platonism threatens to replace God with impersonal mathematical structures, removing divine intentionality and purpose from creation. The philosophy becomes especially controversial when considering ethical implications. If physical reality is secondary to mathematical structure, does human suffering lose importance? If consciousness is ultimately mathematical pattern, does this enhance or diminish human dignity? Digital Platonists typically argue their view doesn't devalue physical experience, but provides deeper context for understanding it, much as understanding the atomic nature of matter doesn't make tables less real or useful. Recognizing reality's mathematical foundation doesn't diminish human experience but enriches it, argues mathematician and philosopher James Franklin. Just as understanding the mathematical structure of music deepens, rather than diminishes our appreciation, seeing reality's mathematical depth enhances, rather than reduces its significance. Practical implications extend to artificial intelligence. If consciousness is ultimately mathematical structure, rather than specifically biological process, then artificial minds could theoretically be just as conscious as human ones, not merely simulating consciousness, but actually experiencing it. This blurs boundaries between natural and artificial intelligence in ways many find philosophically troubling. Modern digital physics pushes digital Platonism into increasingly concrete territory. Physicists like Stephen Wolfram propose that space, time, and fundamental particles might emerge from simple computational rules operating on abstract networks, bringing Platonism from philosophical speculation into testable scientific hypothesis. If reality is fundamentally computational, digital Platonism moves from philosophy to physics. Perhaps what makes digital Platonism most thought-provoking is how it challenges our most basic intuitions about reality. We naturally consider the physical world primary and mathematics secondary, a tool we invented to describe what we see. The suggestion that this relationship is precisely backward, that mathematics is primary and physical reality secondary, forces reconsideration of what existence itself means. Are you and everything you perceive merely approximate shadows of perfect mathematical forms? Is the physical universe itself a kind of simulation run on the substrate of mathematical reality? Digital Platonism offers no comfortable answers, but raises questions striking at the foundation of our understanding of reality itself. Thanatism. Everyone dies. The forests die. The oceans die. The atmosphere dies. The insects die. Democracy dies. Hope dies. And the economic system accelerating all this death refuses to die. Welcome to Thanatism, the philosophical position that contemporary capitalism functions as a global death cult, systematically privileging short-term profit over long-term survival in ways that cannot be reformed but only replaced. It names a system that knowingly chooses extinction over transformation, that would rather end human civilization than change its operating principles. Capitalism does not, contrary to the PR, deliver the goods. Not anymore, argues media theorist Mackenzie Wark, who coined the term Thanatism. It is now a system for delivering the bads. Increasingly, it's a way of organizing the non-survival of the species. It's a death cult. Unlike traditional Marxism, focusing primarily on class exploitation, Thanatism emphasizes capitalism's existential threat to continued human existence. It scrutinizes a system that treats planetary boundaries as externalities, future generations as non-entities, and technological risks as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of immediate returns. The philosophy's controversial core isn't merely that capitalism has negative effects, but that it operates as an emergent death drive, a system structurally committed to choices that lead toward extinction regardless of the intentions of individual participants. The philosophical framework centers on three interlocking principles. First, temporal disruption. Capitalism's structural demand for continual growth and quarterly returns makes planning for multi-generational survival impossible. Second, value inversion. The system assigns monetary value to activities destroying long-term survival conditions while leaving life-sustaining processes unvalued. Third, abstraction dominance. Financial representations of reality override physical reality in decision-making, allowing ecosystem collapse to appear as mere balance sheet adjustments. Our current system treats climate change, biodiversity collapse, and potential civilizational failure as externalities, costs to be pushed elsewhere, rather than direct threats to continued existence, explains economist Kate Raworth. This isn't irrational behavior within the system, but perfectly rational behavior in a fundamentally irrational system. What distinguishes Thanatism from standard environmental or anti-capitalist critiques is its unflinching assessment of time horizons. It argues that the choice isn't between capitalism and some alternative economic system, but between capitalism and having a future at all. The philosophy rejects green capitalism and other reform proposals as fundamentally insufficient given the timescales of environmental breakdown versus the inherent short-termism of market mechanisms. Consider concrete examples. Fossil fuel companies continue exploration despite knowing their proven reserves already exceed what can be burned without catastrophic climate change. Pharmaceutical companies prioritize profitable lifestyle drugs over vital antibiotics, despite growing antimicrobial resistance. Technology companies develop artificial intelligence capabilities without robust safety measures, despite existential risk assessments. Financial markets demand continuous growth on a finite planet with physical limits. In each case, the system rewards behaviors that prioritize immediate returns over continued existence. The defining tension of our time isn't capitalism versus socialism, but capitalism versus a survivable future, argues political philosopher Roy Scranton. The system is operating exactly as designed, efficiently converting living systems into financial abstractions, regardless of long-term consequences. Critics argue that THANATICISM represents a fatalistic misreading of both capitalism's adaptability and technological potential. They point to renewable energy development, circular economy innovations, and sustainability initiatives as evidence that market systems can address existential threats. From this perspective, the philosophy's dire assessment reflects political bias rather than objective analysis of capitalism's capacity for self-correction through innovation and shifting consumer preferences. THANATICISM fundamentally misunderstands how markets drive innovation precisely in response to existential challenges, contends economist Deirdre McCloskey. The same profit motive criticized for creating environmental problems drives the technological solutions that will ultimately solve them. Supporters respond that such optimism reflects a category error, treating physical planetary boundaries as flexible constraints that can be overcome through innovation, rather than hard limits that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. They argue that capitalism's internal logic systematically prevents the scale and speed of transformation needed, pointing to decades of environmental summits, pledges, and targets that consistently fail to significantly alter the trajectory toward ecological collapse. The philosophy becomes particularly controversial when examining proposed solutions. THANATICISM suggests that neither reform nor revolution within existing conceptual frameworks will suffice, that addressing existential risk requires fundamentally reimagining human relations to time, value, and each other. This position alienates both conventional environmentalists focused on incremental policy changes and traditional leftists focused on worker ownership of the same productive processes. It demands something more radical, a complete reconceptualization of prosperity, progress, and human flourishing. The challenge isn't finding slightly more sustainable ways to continue current patterns of production and consumption, argues philosopher Timothy Morton. The challenge is recognizing that those patterns themselves, regardless of who owns the means of production, are incompatible with continued human existence beyond a few more decades. Religious critics note that THANATICISM's framing of capitalism as death cult appropriates theological language while emptying it of transcendent meaning. From religious perspectives, authentic death cults historically contained metaphysical frameworks addressing mortality's meaning, while capitalism's death orientation represents not spiritual approach to finitude, but its nihilistic denial, the attempt to accumulate endlessly despite mortality's certainty. The philosophical position creates uncomfortable political alignments. Conservative traditionalists might share concerns about capitalism's destruction of stable communities and natural systems while rejecting systemic alternatives. Progressives might embrace the critique of capitalism while finding the assessment of reform possibilities too pessimistic. Accelerationists might perversely embrace capitalism's death drive as necessary, creative destruction clearing path for something new. These strange alignments reveal how THANATICISM cuts across conventional political categories. Perhaps most provocatively, THANATICISM challenges whether capitalism should properly be considered rational at all. If rationality fundamentally connects to survival and flourishing, then a system structured to undermine its own long-term viability cannot be considered rational, regardless of its internal logical consistency. This framing inverts standard discourse positioning market systems as rational and alternatives as idealistic, suggesting instead that continuing current arrangements represents the true utopianism given physical planetary constraints. The truly irrational position isn't imagining alternatives to capitalism, argues philosopher Slavoj Žižek, but imagining that capitalism can continue without catastrophic consequences. The fantasy isn't radical change, but business as usual. The philosophy gains empirical support from scientific assessments of planetary boundaries, biodiversity collapse, and climate tipping points, all indicating that current economic arrangements are rapidly undermining their own physical prerequisites. It also draws on psychological research showing how short-term incentives consistently override long-term planning even when participants intellectually understand the consequences, paralleling how market structures override sustainability despite widespread knowledge of environmental threats. Whether viewed as unwarranted catastrophism or necessary clarity, THANATICISM forces confrontation with capitalism's temporal contradictions and existential implications. It raises discomforting questions about a system that, regardless of individual intentions, structurally prioritizes immediate returns over continued existence. In naming contemporary capitalism as fundamentally thanatic, oriented toward death rather than life, it challenges whether reforming such a system is possible or whether survival requires imagining and implementing something entirely different. Ontological anarchism. The true prison isn't capitalism, the state, or social norms. The true prison is reality itself, the metaphysical cage of fixed being, unified identity, and universal law from which no political revolution can free us. Only by rejecting not just political authority but the tyranny of reality with a capital R can genuine freedom emerge. This is ontological anarchism, a radical philosophical position that extends anarchist revolt beyond opposing governments to opposing the very concept of governed reality. The empire has never ended, declares philosopher-poet Hakim Bey in his seminal text, Temporary Autonomous Zone. Ontological anarchism is the only doctrine that opposes control itself as illusion, not merely as undesirable. We fight not for freedom against control, but for freedom against the definition of freedom, as exclusively human against control. Unlike political anarchism focused on dismantling state power, ontological anarchism targets deeper structures of control, the metaphysical assumptions that reality consists of fixed laws, stable identities, and objective truths independent of perception and interpretation. These assumptions, ontological anarchists argue, represent the ultimate authoritarian structure, a cosmic order from which even the most politically liberated humans cannot escape. The philosophy draws from diverse intellectual traditions: Taoism's concept of wu-wei, non-action, Heraclitus's emphasis on flux over stability, Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead, quantum physics' uncertainty principles, and chaos theory's demonstration that seemingly deterministic systems generate unpredictability. From these sources emerges a perspective viewing reality not as ordered cosmos, but as creative chaos temporarily crystallized into apparent patterns. Every moment remaking itself from nothing, writes philosopher-anarchist Peter Lamborn Wilson. The cosmos is not governed by laws imposed from outside, but creates its own principles spontaneously at each instant. Reality is not discovered but created, not a tyrannical kingdom but an anarchist federation of momentary autonomous zones. What makes this philosophy particularly radical is its practical implications. If reality itself lacks inherent structure, then liberation requires more than changing social arrangements. It demands tactical opposition to consensus reality through what ontological anarchists call poetic terrorism and art sabotage. These practices aim not at conventional political goals, but at cracking consensus reality, open to reveal chaos beneath, creating temporary spaces where different ontological possibilities emerge. Consider practical examples: orchestrating unexplainable events in public spaces, creating art that disrupts habitual perception patterns, developing language that escapes binary categorization, practicing sexuality that defies orientation categories, engineering temporary autonomous zones where conventional rules of reality seem suspended. Each represents an attempt to exploit ontological cracks in consensus reality's facade. The universe does not operate according to any prior blueprint or divine architectural plan, explains philosopher William Connolly, whose work shares themes with ontological anarchism. The cosmos is incomplete and unfinished, filled with emergent processes that no metaphysical system can fully capture or predict. Freedom lies not in discovering reality's laws, but in participating in reality's ongoing self-creation. Critics from across the philosophical spectrum find ontological anarchism deeply problematic. Analytical philosophers dismiss it as semantic confusion, mistaking limitations in human understanding of reality for evidence that reality itself lacks structure. Religious thinkers view it as spiritual rebellion against divine order, substituting cosmic chaos for divine providence. Conventional anarchists worry it distracts from concrete political struggles by focusing on metaphysical abstractions. Ontological anarchism represents philosophy's unproductive turn toward poetic obscurantism rather than clear reasoning, argues philosopher Daniel Dennett. The claim that reality lacks inherent structure confuses epistemological limitations with ontological conditions. Our inability to fully comprehend reality doesn't mean reality itself lacks order. Social justice advocates raise additional concerns that privileging chaos over structure potentially undermines conceptual frameworks necessary for identifying and addressing systemic oppression. If all categories become fluid and all structures provisional, how can we name and combat racism, sexism, or economic exploitation requiring stable conceptual frameworks to identify patterns of harm? Defenders respond that ontological anarchism doesn't abandon structure entirely, but reframes it as temporary, provisional, and created rather than permanent, necessary, and discovered. This distinction matters because structures presented as reflecting eternal reality resist change far more effectively than those acknowledged as temporary constructions. The philosophy doesn't reject using categories strategically while remembering their provisional nature. The point isn't that oppression doesn't exist, but that presenting our conceptual models of oppression as reflecting eternal metaphysical realities rather than provisional tools replicates the very authoritarian metaphysics that enables oppression, argues contemporary ontological anarchist Alejandro de Acosta. Revolutionary politics requires ontological flexibility, not rigid metaphysics. The philosophy becomes particularly controversial around questions of scientific knowledge. Does rejecting reality's inherent structure mean rejecting scientific findings about climate change, evolution, or public health? Ontological anarchists typically distinguish between rejecting scientific methodologies as useful tools and rejecting scientism, the elevation of scientific knowledge into metaphysical truth with a capital T that demands obedience rather than provisional models guiding action. Practical applications extend into unexpected domains. Some ontological anarchists experiment with chaos magic, ritualistic practices acknowledging belief systems as useful fictions rather than eternal truths, allowing practitioners to temporarily adopt different ontological frameworks for specific purposes. Others develop immersive art experiences designed to disrupt habitual perception patterns. Still others create intentional communities operating according to alternative ontological assumptions about time, property, or identity. The most radical aspect isn't rejecting this reality for another, but recognizing all realities as constructions we participate in creating, explains contemporary philosopher Simon Critchley. The freedom sought isn't freedom from constraint within reality, but freedom to participate in reality's ongoing creation. The philosophy stands in complex relationship with psychedelic experience and madness, both states where consensus reality appears to dissolve, revealing alternative ontological possibilities. While not advocating universal psychedelic use or romanticizing mental illness, ontological anarchists view these boundary states as revealing the constructed nature of normal perception, typically mistaken for inevitable reality. Religious and spiritual traditions meet ontological anarchism in complex ways. Some mystical traditions, Sufi Islam's concept of fana, annihilation of the self, Zen Buddhism's emphasis on emptiness, or Christian negative theology's God beyond being, share the critique of fixed reality while directing it towards spiritual rather than anarchist ends. These parallels create unexpected bridges between political radicalism and mystical traditions. Whether viewed as profound insight or philosophical confusion, ontological anarchism represents one of contemporary philosophy's most radical positions, extending anarchist critique beyond political arrangements to reality's metaphysical structure itself. By proposing that the ultimate authority to be overthrown isn't any government but reality with a capital R, it presents the most comprehensive rejection possible of external governance, a philosophical position that finds liberation only when nothing, not even existence itself, is accepted as fixed, permanent, or beyond challenge. Infinite ethics, the child drowning before your eyes, the millions starving in distant countries. the billions of future humans whose existence depends on our choices, the trillions of digital minds that advanced civilizations might create, the infinite suffering or joy that could exist in an eternal universe. Traditional moral frameworks collapse when confronted with infinity. No matter how many lives you save, infinitely more remain in need. No matter how much good you create, it becomes a 0% of the possible good in an infinite cosmos. Every moral action, no matter how heroic, becomes mathematically meaningless against the infinite backdrop of cosmic possibility. This is the central crisis of infinite ethics, a philosophical domain exploring how moral frameworks break down when applied to infinite values. It reveals how our ethical intuitions, evolved for small-scale tribal interactions, produce catastrophic contradictions and paradoxes when extended to cosmic scales and infinite possibilities. Our moral mathematics fails catastrophically when infinities enter the equation, explains philosopher Nick Bostrom. If the universe contains infinite value, then no finite action can change the total amount of good or evil. If multiple infinities of different values exist, we face incomparable infinities where standard ethical calculations become undefined. Infinite ethics explores whether meaningful ethics remains possible in a potentially infinite cosmos. Unlike traditional ethical systems concerned with individual virtue or social arrangements, infinite ethics confronts problems arising specifically from infinities in moral calculations. Can you meaningfully increase an infinite amount of value? If infinitely many beings exist, does saving one life accomplish anything? If eternal afterlives or infinite universes exist, do finite actions in our mortal lives have any significance whatsoever? The problem emerges across diverse scenarios. Consider an eternal universe containing infinitely many inhabited planets. No matter how many civilizations you save, infinitely many remain in both the saved and unsaved categories. Consider digital consciousness that could be copied infinitely, creating unlimited amounts of suffering or happiness through replication. Consider the Pascal's mugging scenario, where someone threatens to torture infinite beings unless you pay a ransom. Should you comply regardless of how improbable their claim, since the expected value calculation remains infinite? Traditional ethical systems assume actions have measurable impacts on total value, notes philosopher Amanda Askell. But infinity isn't a number. It's a different mathematical category altogether. When infinity enters ethics, our moral calculations don't just become difficult, they become fundamentally broken in ways that threaten the coherence of any consequentialist ethical framework. The philosophy becomes particularly disturbing when considering specific thought experiments. The infinitarian paralysis scenario suggests that in an infinite universe, any action you take will cause both infinite good and infinite harm due to its endless causal ripples, rendering all choices morally equivalent. The infinite torture problem considers whether creating infinite happiness for one being could justify infinite suffering for another, since both values are infinite. The infinity hijack considers whether any finite probability of infinite value should dominate all moral decisions regardless of near-term consequences. Traditional ethical frameworks provide little guidance. Utilitarianism collapses when attempting to maximize infinite utility. Kantian ethics struggles with universal laws applied to infinite domains. Virtue ethics offers no clear path for developing virtues relevant to infinite consequences. The challenge isn't merely applying existing frameworks to new problems, but recognizing that infinities potentially render any finite evolved ethical intuitions fundamentally inadequate. We evolved to handle small numbers, to distinguish between one lion and two lions, not to comprehend billions, let alone infinities, explains cognitive scientist Steven Pinker. Our moral intuitions similarly evolved for immediate social interactions, not cosmic-scale ethical calculations. Infinite ethics reveals the limitations of evolved moral psychology when confronting scales and complexities beyond its design parameters. Religious traditions have historically engaged with infinities through concepts of eternal reward, punishment, or divine perspective. Yet even theological ethics struggles with paradoxes of infinite value. Can finite human choices justify infinite hell? Can any finite good compensate for infinite suffering? Does an infinite God's perspective render finite human ethics meaningless? These questions reveal tensions within religious frameworks when infinity enters ethical equations. Critics argue that infinite ethics represents intellectual indulgence disconnected from practical moral questions. They suggest that while mathematical infinities may exist abstractly, practical ethics necessarily concerns finite beings making choices with finite consequences. From this perspective, the subject represents philosophical confusion rather than genuine moral insight. Infinite ethics confuses mathematical concepts with practical reality, argues philosopher Martha Nussbaum. Actual ethical decisions always occur within finite contexts, involving finite beings. Introducing infinities doesn't enhance ethical understanding, but obscures the concrete human concerns that genuine ethics must address. Defenders respond that scientific cosmology increasingly suggests we may indeed inhabit an infinite universe with infinite consequences following from our actions. If the universe is spatially infinite, as current evidence suggests, then infinitely many copies of Earth likely exist, each containing beings experiencing the consequences of choices structurally identical to our own. If the multiverse theory proves correct, infinitely many universe variants may branch from each decision. These scenarios aren't merely philosophical abstractions, but potential cosmic realities with profound ethical implications. The field connects to practical concerns through emerging technologies. Advanced artificial intelligence could potentially create sentient digital minds replicable at massive scales, creating vast or potentially infinite amounts of subjective experience. Space colonization could eventually reach scales where human decisions impact trillions of future lives across cosmic distances. These possibilities force confrontation with ethical infinities, not as abstract puzzles but as potential future realities requiring moral frameworks that remain coherent at cosmic scales. What distinguishes sophisticated approaches from simplistic ones is the recognition that different types of infinities exist with different ethical implications. Potential infinity, unlimited growth without reaching actual infinity, creates different problems than actual infinity, completed infinite sets. Countable infinities, like the set of integers, create different problems than uncountable infinities, like the set of real numbers. Each type requires different mathematical and philosophical tools to address. The challenge isn't merely that moral mathematics becomes difficult with infinities, but that standard arithmetic operations become undefined, explains philosopher Daniel Kokotajlo. Adding or subtracting from infinity doesn't change its value. Comparing different infinities requires sophisticated mathematics beyond simple greater than or less than relations. These mathematical complexities translate directly into ethical complexities when considering infinite values. Perhaps most disturbingly, infinite ethics suggests our moral intuitions themselves may be fundamentally inadequate for the universe we actually inhabit. If reality contains actual infinities, then ethical systems based on finite intuitions may be as inadequate for cosmic moral questions as Newtonian physics is for describing quantum phenomena. This raises the unsettling possibility that genuinely coherent ethics might require embracing principles deeply counterintuitive to evolved human moral psychology. Whether viewed as philosophical indulgence or necessary moral preparation for humanity's cosmic future, infinite ethics forces confrontation with the limitations of traditional ethical frameworks when addressing infinite scales and values. It challenges us to develop moral mathematics sophisticated enough to remain coherent when confronting the potential infinities of cosmic reality, digital consciousness, or eternal existence. A philosophical domain where our intuitions fail and conventional ethics reaches its breaking point. Biopolitical neoliberalism. Your heartbeat sells sneakers. Your anxiety markets pharmaceuticals. Your insecurities drive cosmetic surgeries. Your fertility fuels medical industries. Your sleep patterns generate subscription revenue. Your genetic data trains proprietary algorithms. Your attention feeds engagement metrics. Your organs provide transplant inventories. Your reproductive capacity supplies adoption markets. Your illness creates shareholder value. You believed you owned your body? Under biopolitical neoliberalism, your flesh is merely raw material awaiting profitable extraction, a biological resource to be optimized, quantified, and monetized within markets that transform human existence itself into capital. The body is no longer a site of resistance against capital, but capital's primary production site, explains philosopher Franco Bifo Berardi. Contemporary capitalism extracts value, not just from your labor, but from your biological processes themselves. Your health becomes productive capacity. Your appearance becomes marketing asset. Your genetic data becomes proprietary information. Your status as human subject has been replaced by your function as biological resource. Biopolitical neoliberalism represents the intersection of Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics, the governance of populations through biological management, with neoliberalism's extension of market logic to all domains of life. This controversial framework analyzes how contemporary capitalism doesn't merely commodify body parts or processes, but reconceptualizes biological existence itself as human capital requiring investment, optimization, and profitable deployment within increasingly medicalized markets. Unlike traditional exploitation extracting value from labor, biopolitical extraction transforms intimate biological functions into productive processes. Fertility becomes reproductive capital, managed through medical markets in eggs, sperm, and surrogacy. Appearance becomes aesthetic capital, requiring continuous investment through fitness regimens and cosmetic interventions. Genetic information becomes proprietary data, harvested through testing services claiming to enhance health while building lucrative databases. Health itself becomes speculative asset, with insurance markets betting on and against bodily failure. The perfect biopolitical subject, argues philosopher Byung-Chul Han, is not the factory worker whose body moves according to industrial rhythms, but the entrepreneur of the self who voluntarily invests in their own biological capital, tracking health metrics, enhancing appearance, optimizing productivity, all while experiencing this self-exploitation as personal freedom. This philosophy reveals the political dimensions of seemingly personal health practices. The explosion of self-tracking technologies reflects not just individual health interests, but economic imperatives requiring workers to monitor and maximize their biological productivity. The wellness industry selling optimization represents not liberation, but the extension of work discipline into biological existence itself. The quantified self movement translates human experience into management metrics. Even resistance to mainstream medicine often reproduces identical logics through alternative health markets selling different optimization products. What makes this philosophical perspective particularly provocative is its challenge to bodily autonomy itself. The rallying cry, "My body, my choice," assumes a sovereign self making decisions about a body they own. Biopolitical neoliberalism suggests this sovereignty is largely illusory. Our most intimate bodily choices are shaped by market imperatives, so thoroughly internalized we mistake them for personal desires. Our apparent freedom masks our function as biological resources within health markets that profit regardless of outcomes. Freedom within this system means freedom to manage your biological assets according to market logics, explains critical theorist Melinda Cooper. You're free to enhance your marketability through fitness, free to invest in appearance capital through cosmetic procedures, free to monetize your reproductive capacity through surrogacy markets. This isn't liberation, but the most intimate form of capitalist subjectivity, the entrepreneurial management of biological resources you've come to think of as yourself. The framework becomes particularly unsettling when examining how different bodies are valued within biopolitical capitalism. Bodies that resist optimization or monetization, through disability, illness, aging, or non-normative appearance, become marked as problematic, requiring either profitable rehabilitation or profitable containment. The medical-industrial complex profits from both enhancing already privileged bodies and managing bodies deemed deficient, creating market incentives to continuously expand both categories. Consider practical examples. Pharmaceutical companies driving the medicalization of normal human variation, to create new markets for their products. Wellness influencers selling optimization through subscription content and branded products. Fertility industries extracting reproductive value from economically vulnerable women to serve wealthy clients. Fitness technologies transforming exercise from leisure into productivity metric. Health insurance using tracking data to adjust premiums based on biological compliance. Each represents the extraction of value from biological processes reframed as capital. Critics argue this perspective misinterprets genuine health advances and individual empowerment through biological knowledge. They suggest that health technologies, medical innovations, and wellness practices represent legitimate progress, improving human lives rather than simply new forms of capitalist extraction. From this perspective, the philosophical framework represents paranoid oversimplification, ignoring real benefits people derive from medical and technological advancement. Framing healthcare innovations primarily as capitalist exploitation fundamentally misunderstands their genuine benefits, argues bioethicist Julian Savulescu. Advanced medical technologies, preventative health measures, and biological knowledge have dramatically improved human well-being regardless of the economic systems delivering them. Defenders respond that recognizing the political dimensions of health practices doesn't deny their potential benefits, but contextualizes them within systems that distribute those benefits unequally, while universalizing responsibility for biological optimization. The criticism isn't of health technologies themselves, but of how they operate within economic systems that transform health from social right into personal responsibility and market opportunity. The COVID-19 pandemic dramatically illustrated these dynamics. Public health measures were consistently evaluated through economic frameworks. Bodies became classified as essential or non-essential based on their economic function. Vaccine distribution followed market logics and property rights rather than global need. The crisis revealed how thoroughly economic rationality has penetrated our understanding of biological life itself, with health measures justified through productivity metrics and population management framed in terms of economic calculations. Religious critics note how biopolitical neoliberalism transforms theological understanding of the body as sacred gift into market understanding of body as personal property requiring investment. Where religious traditions emphasize accepting bodily limitations as defining the human condition, market biopolitics treats all limitations as technological problems awaiting profitable solutions, a profound shift with spiritual implications for human self-understanding. Perhaps most controversially, the philosophy suggests that even critical health movements often reproduce biopolitical logics through different markets. Natural health approaches, alternative medicine, and anti-establishment health communities frequently operate through identical frameworks of personal responsibility, biological optimization, and commodified solutions, just with different products and authorities. Genuine alternatives would require not just different health technologies, but fundamentally different relationships between biological life and economic value. The problem isn't simply medicalization or particular health technologies, explains philosopher Nicholas Rose, but how biological life itself has become subject to political calculation and economic rationality. Our bodies haven't been colonized by specific technologies, but by market logics that reconceptualize biological existence itself as capital to be optimized, invested in, and exploited for value. Whether viewed as critical insight or paranoid overreading, biopolitical neoliberalism forces us to examine how market imperatives shape our most intimate bodily experiences. It challenges us to question whether our pursuit of better bodies represents authentic flourishing or compliance with economic demands, and whether what we experience as bodily autonomy might actually be the most successful form of control, one we've internalized so completely we mistake it for freedom. MEREOLOGICAL nihilism. The chair you're sitting on doesn't exist. The device you're using doesn't exist. Your body doesn't exist. Your loved ones don't exist. This room, this building, this city, none of them exist. Only the most fundamental particles of physics exist. Everything else, every object you've ever encountered, every person you've ever loved, even your own self, is merely a convenient fiction, a way of speaking about arrangements of particles that have no objective reality as composite objects. This is mereological nihilism, the philosophical position that composite objects are not real. There are no tables, no chairs, no people, no planets, no galaxies, declares philosopher Peter van Inwagen. There are only simples, the fundamental particles of physics, arranged in various ways. Our language about ordinary objects is useful for practical purposes, but fundamentally mistaken about what exists. Unlike other forms of nihilism denying meaning or value, mereological nihilism, also called compositional nihilism, makes a specific ontological claim. Composite objects don't exist. Only simples, particles that have no parts themselves, are real. Everything we perceive as objects with parts is merely particles arranged object-wise, with no additional entity existing over and above those particles. The chair isn't a chair. It's quarks, electrons, and other fundamental particles arranged chairwise. This philosophical position begins with a puzzle. If you have 6 particles forming an object, what exactly makes it one thing rather than just 6 separate things? The particles themselves exist, but does some additional entity, the composite object, also exist? What exactly would this additional entity be, separate from its components? Mereological nihilists answer that no such additional entity exists. Only the particles themselves are real. The fundamental mistake in ordinary thinking is counting twice, explains philosopher Theodore Sider. We count the particles, then we also count the object they supposedly form. But this involves double counting. There are only particles arranged in various ways, not particles plus some additional object they compose. The view becomes truly radical when applied to humans. If mereological nihilism is correct, you don't exist as a composite entity. There are only particles arranged in a human pattern, with no additional entity called you existing over and above those particles. Your sense of being a unified self persisting through time is a useful fiction. In reality, there are only fundamental particles arranged in patterns that change from moment to moment. The philosophy generates disturbing implications for personal identity. If there are no composite objects, then there are no people, just particles arranged person-wise. This undermines not just our ordinary self-understanding, but profound ethical frameworks built on personhood. If there are no people, what happens to concepts like moral responsibility, personal rights, or loving relationships? Can particles arranged person-wise be held responsible for their actions? Can you love particles arranged spouse-wise? The implications for ethics are profound, but not necessarily destructive, argues philosopher Trenton Merricks. Instead of saying, "I love you," a mereological nihilist might say, "The particles arranged me-wise have feelings toward the particles arranged you-wise." Clumsy, but the feelings themselves remain significant regardless of ontological status. Critics argue the position leads to absurdity. If only fundamental particles exist, then virtually all human knowledge becomes technically false. Science isn't studying real objects but merely particle arrangements. History isn't recording events involving real people, but merely describing changing particle configurations. Language itself seems undermined. Since most words refer to composite objects, the theory claims don't exist. Mereological nihilism makes nonsense of almost all human discourse, objects philosopher Catherine Koslicki. If I say, "Hand me that cup," I'm supposedly referring to something that doesn't exist. This level of revision to ordinary understanding isn't philosophical insight, but reductio ad absurdum of the position itself. Defenders respond with deflationary interpretations. They argue that sentences about composite objects can be translated into sentences about simples arranged in particular ways without loss of meaning. The table is brown becomes, "There are simples arranged table-wise that reflect light in brown-producing ways." This preserves the practical utility of object talk while maintaining ontological parsimony. The philosophical position connects to fundamental questions in physics and metaphysics. If quantum field theory suggests that even fundamental particles are merely excitations in fields, does this support or undermine mereological nihilism? If the fundamental level of reality consists of indeterminate quantum probabilities rather than distinct particles, what becomes of the view that only simples exist? These questions reveal how abstract philosophical positions connect to our most basic understanding of physical reality. Religious perspectives typically reject mereological nihilism entirely. Most theological traditions emphasize the reality of persons, souls, or composite entities, like communities and creation itself. The reduction of existence to merely fundamental particles conflicts with religious understanding of divinely created order, where composite entities have genuine ontological status and purpose. For traditional theology, the world's complexity reflects divine intention, explains philosopher Robert Koons. Reducing reality exclusively to fundamental particles eliminates hierarchies of being and purpose that most religious traditions consider essential to creation structure. Paradoxically, some mystical traditions show unexpected alignment with aspects of the philosophy. Buddhist concepts of anatta, no self, and sunyata, emptiness, similarly question the ultimate reality of composite entities, suggesting that our perception of unified objects represents conventional rather than ultimate truth. The difference lies in Buddhism's questioning of whether even fundamental particles have independent existence. The philosophy creates strange intersections with consciousness studies. If conscious experience seems unified, yet mereological nihilism denies unified entities exist, how should we understand consciousness? Is it an illusion generated by particles arranged brainwise? Or does consciousness itself represent evidence against mereological nihilism by demonstrating a genuinely unified phenomenon that can't be reduced to its components? Perhaps most provocatively, mereological nihilism doesn't just eliminate ordinary objects, but potentially eliminates the physical world as we understand it. If composite objects don't exist, then the mountains, oceans, planets, and galaxies we perceive are merely conceptual impositions on particle arrangements with no independent reality. The philosophy doesn't just eliminate some objects while preserving others. It eliminates the entire world of perceptible objects, leaving only the imperceptible particles of fundamental physics. The world as we perceive it is, in a certain sense, an illusion, acknowledges philosopher Ross Cameron. But this doesn't make our perceptions false, so much as it clarifies their relationship to fundamental reality. We perceive patterns of particles as objects because doing so serves our practical purposes, not because unified objects exist independently of our conceptualization. Whether viewed as logical consistency taken to extremes or absurd hyper-reductionism, mereological nihilism forces us to confront fundamental questions about existence itself. It challenges our most basic assumptions about the objects we interact with daily, suggesting that the world we perceive bears little resemblance to what actually exists. In stripping reality down to only its most fundamental components, it presents perhaps the most radical ontological revision possible, a philosophical position that, if true, means almost everything you've ever believed exists actually doesn't. CARNISM. Dogs are friends. Pigs are food. Horses are companions. Cows are dinner. Lions are admirable. Chickens are nuggets. This isn't a random collection of cultural facts. It's the manifestation of a powerful belief system so normalized we don't even recognize it as a belief system at all. This invisible ideology, CARNISM, conditions us to eat certain animals while loving others, to perceive some beings as worthy of moral consideration while viewing others as living commodities. The radical insight of CARNISM isn't that eating animals is problematic. It's that we don't see eating animals as a choice reflecting specific beliefs at all. We don't see meat eating as we see vegetarianism, as a choice based on a set of assumptions about animals, our world, and ourselves, explains psychologist Melanie Joy, who coined the term. Rather, we see it as a given, the natural thing to do. We eat animals without thinking about what we're doing and why, because the belief system that underlies this behavior is invisible. Unlike veganism or vegetarianism, which represent conscious choices to reject animal consumption, CARNISM operates as an invisible dominant ideology, the unexamined default setting in most societies. This philosophy isn't merely about dietary choices, but about the psychological and social mechanisms that enable animal consumption through selective empathy, cognitive distortion, and moral disconnection. It names the belief system most people don't realize they have. The core insight reveals how meat consumption requires psychological numbing and categorical manipulation. We must care about some animals, pets, while disconnecting from others, food animals, despite their similar capacities for suffering, intelligence, and social bonds. This selective moral consideration requires elaborate psychological defense mechanisms, the 3 N's of CARNISM, believing meat consumption is natural, normal, and necessary. These same mechanisms, the 3 N's of justification, have been invoked throughout human history to justify all forms of exploitation, notes Joy. Slavery was once considered natural, normal, and necessary. Male dominance was considered natural, normal, and necessary. This pattern of justification has remained remarkably consistent across time and cultures. What makes this philosophical framework particularly provocative is how it inverts traditional understanding. Rather than seeing veganism as the belief system requiring justification, it positions meat eating as the ideology demanding examination. It challenges the assumption that eating animals represents the absence of a belief system rather than a specific set of beliefs rendered invisible through cultural dominance. The philosophy becomes truly unsettling when examining the psychological mechanisms maintaining carnism. People generally care about animal welfare and oppose animal cruelty, yet participate in a system that necessarily involves animal suffering. This cognitive dissonance requires elaborate psychological defenses, distancing language, pork, not pig meat, invisibility of production, ag-gag laws hiding slaughterhouse conditions, and classification schemes separating food animals from companion animals, despite arbitrary distinctions between categories. The central paradox of carnism is that most people care about animals while also eating them, explains philosopher Lisa Kemmerer. This doesn't reflect moral inconsistency so much as the power of an invisible ideology to disconnect our values from our practices through categorization, distancing, and normalization. Critics argue the framework fundamentally mischaracterizes human omnivory. They contend that eating animals isn't an ideology, but simply reflects evolutionary biology. Humans evolved as omnivores with biological adaptations for meat consumption. From this perspective, the term carnism pathologizes natural human diet, while elevating plant-based diets to unjustified moral superiority. Calling omnivory carnism is like calling breathing respirationism, argues philosopher Roger Scruton. It attempts to transform natural biological functions into ideological choices requiring justification. Human omnivory isn't a belief system, but a biological reality reflecting our evolutionary history. Defenders respond that while humans can digest meat, this biological capacity doesn't determine moral necessity. They distinguish between biological capability and moral choice, arguing that the ability to consume animal products doesn't dictate the ethical permissibility of doing so. Just as human biology enables many behaviors we reject on ethical grounds, the capacity for meat digestion doesn't render animal consumption morally neutral. The fact that we can eat meat doesn't mean we must or should, explains ethicist Peter Singer. Biology determines what's possible, not what's ethical. Humans have historically rationalized many practices that served our interests by portraying them as natural and therefore beyond ethical questioning. Religious traditions engage with carnism in complex ways. Many spiritual traditions incorporate animal consumption while emphasizing compassionate treatment, ritual slaughter, or hierarchical creation models positioning humans above animals. Others, like Jainism and certain Buddhist lineages, explicitly reject animal consumption based on principles of nonviolence and compassion. These diverse approaches reveal that relationships with animals have always involved moral frameworks rather than merely unexamined natural behaviors. The philosophical framework becomes particularly controversial when connecting animal consumption to other systems of domination. Ecofeminist scholars have highlighted connections between exploitation of animals and oppression of marginalized human groups, arguing that the same logic allowing instrumental treatment of animal bodies enables instrumental treatment of certain human bodies. This analysis suggests that CARNism doesn't operate in isolation, but interconnects with other systems of power and privilege. The compartmentalization that allows us to pet dogs while eating pigs reflects the same psychological mechanisms that enable other forms of discrimination, argues ecofeminist Carol J. Adams. We don't see these connections because the dominant culture renders both CARNism and its relationship to other oppressive systems invisible. Perhaps most provocatively, the philosophy suggests that mass animal consumption represents not individual moral failings, but systematic institutional structures shaping individual choices. From childhood socialization normalizing certain animals as food, to government subsidies making animal products artificially affordable, to advertising creating positive associations with meat products, CARNism operates through systems making animal consumption appear inevitable rather than chosen. Individual consumers don't make food choices in a vacuum, explains sociologist David Nybert. Their preferences are shaped by economic systems, cultural conditioning, and institutional arrangements designed to normalize and perpetuate animal consumption regardless of moral implications. The concept creates complex intersections with environmental and health concerns. Growing recognition of animal agriculture's environmental impacts and health consequences of certain consumption patterns adds practical dimensions to what might otherwise remain abstract ethical questions. These practical concerns can sometimes provide entry points for examining CARNism's psychological mechanisms, even for those resistant to ethical arguments about animal suffering. Critics from animal agriculture industries argue that the CARNism framework serves as rhetorical cover for imposing minority dietary preferences on the majority. They position animal consumption as natural human behavior and anti-CARNism as elitist imposition of privileged dietary choices on populations with limited resources or different cultural traditions. This framing attempts to position plant-based advocacy as cultural imperialism rather than ethical critique. Whether viewed as profound insight or manipulative framing, the concept of CARNism forces examination of the invisible belief systems underlying everyday choices. It challenges us to question not just whether animal consumption is justified, but how certain practices become so normalized we no longer recognize them as reflecting specific values and beliefs. In naming the invisible, it makes visible the psychological and social mechanisms that transform certain beings into friends and others into food. POSIDISM. What if I told you there exists a political philosophy that not only welcomed the prospect of nuclear war, but actively hoped for it? A Cold War-era ideology that believed atomic annihilation would clear the path for a perfect communist society, and that the same thinkers were convinced that advanced extraterrestrial civilizations had not only visited Earth, but were themselves communist societies waiting to help us evolve. Welcome to POSIDISM, perhaps the most bizarre revolutionary ideology of the 20th century. Born in the radioactive shadow of the atomic age, POSIDISM emerged from a small Trotskyist splinter group led by Juan Posadas, an Argentine revolutionary whose birth name was Homero Romulo Cristalli Frasnelli. What began as a relatively orthodox Marxist movement in the 1940s transformed into something far stranger by the early 1960s, as Posadas and his followers developed a unique constellation of beliefs that mixed orthodox communism with apocalyptic thinking, nuclear enthusiasm, and ufology. The central premise that shocked the world, nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union, should not be feared but welcomed as the necessary catalyst for worldwide revolution. In Posadas's own words, from his 1962 essay, "Nuclear war is inevitable. It will destroy half of humanity. It is going to destroy immense human riches. It is very possible. The atomic war is going to provoke a true inferno on Earth, but it will not impede communism." This apocalyptic vision wasn't born from nihilism, but from a distorted optimism. Posadas reasoned that the Soviet Union and other socialist states would be better prepared to survive nuclear war due to their planned economies and collective social organization. From the ashes of nuclear destruction, these socialist survivors would build a communist world order, free from capitalism's exploitation. The horrific deaths of millions, perhaps billions, were conceptualized not as tragedy but as a terrible yet necessary price for humanity's ultimate liberation. What makes Posidism truly unique was its incorporation of extraterrestrial life into its political analysis. By the late 1960s, Posadas had become convinced that UFOs were real spacecraft piloted by beings from other worlds. These weren't just random visitors, but representatives of advanced civilizations that had already achieved communism. In his view, any society capable of mastering interstellar travel must have overcome capitalism's inefficiencies. As Posadas wrote, "The flying saucers, the spacecraft that travel from one planet to another, are manned by beings that have organized socially." This cosmic expansion of Marxist theory suggested that communism wasn't merely the next stage in human social evolution, but a universal development occurring throughout the cosmos. The extraterrestrials were not invaders, but potential allies in the revolutionary struggle. Advanced societies watching Earth, perhaps waiting for humans to achieve the social development necessary for open contact. The movement even extended its revolutionary perspective to interspecies relations. Posadas developed a peculiar interest in dolphins, believing their sophisticated communication systems indicated a level of consciousness that humans should attempt to engage with. Essays were written about revolutionary dolphins as potential allies in the struggle for communism. This interest in communicating across species lines mirrored the group's fascination with potential communication with extraterrestrial intelligences. While easy to dismiss as the ravings of a fringe cult, Posidism's development reveals something profound about the psychological climate of the Cold War era. The constant threat of nuclear annihilation led many to develop coping mechanisms for processing this unprecedented existential threat. Where most responded with fear, denial, or resignation, Posidists constructed an ideological framework that transformed the ultimate horror into a moment of revolutionary potential. Nuclear fire wouldn't end history, but accelerate it toward its predetermined conclusion. The post-World War II period also saw an explosion of reported UFO sightings and growing cultural fascination with space. The first satellite, Sputnik, launched in 1957, followed by Yuri Gagarin becoming the first human in space in 1961. Against this backdrop, Posadas' incorporation of extraterrestrial themes into revolutionary politics, while extreme, wasn't occurring in a vacuum, but reflected broader cultural anxieties and fascinations of the era. Posidism never gained mass appeal, remaining confined to small groups primarily in Latin America and Europe. At its height, the movement had modest followings in Argentina, Cuba, Mexico, Spain, and Italy. The International Posidist Fourth International published newspapers and pamphlets in several languages, maintaining a small but dedicated cadre of revolutionary militants convinced that nuclear war and alien contact were on the horizon. The death of Juan Posadas in 1981 weakened the already marginalized movement, and the end of the Cold War further undermined its apocalyptic expectations. By the 1990s, organized Posadism had largely disappeared as a political force. The fall of the Soviet Union and the apparent triumph of liberal capitalism seemed to consign Posadist thought to the dustbin of revolutionary history. Yet strangely, the 21st century has seen a revival of interest in Posidism, not as a serious political movement, but as a fascinating historical curiosity and ironic meme. Internet communities devoted to leftist politics have embraced Posadist imagery and ideas, often playfully. The combination of space communism, nuclear acceleration, and dolphin communication provides rich material for political satire and commentary on contemporary anxieties. What made Posidism truly controversial, beyond its embrace of nuclear holocaust, was its challenge to the linear progressive vision of history embraced by both liberal capitalism and orthodox Marxism. Both traditions assumed a gradual improvement in human conditions through either market expansion or class struggle. POSIDISM suggested a more apocalyptic rupture, that true progress might require passing through a moment of near-total destruction. This accelerationist logic, which sacrifices present generations for imagined future ones, represents a moral challenge that continues to haunt revolutionary politics. The extraterrestrial elements of POSIDISM also raise philosophical questions about anthropocentrism in political thought. By imagining communism as a universal development occurring across species and planets, Posadas pushed Marxist theory beyond its human-centered origins. This cosmic expansion of revolutionary horizons anticipated later theoretical developments that attempt to think beyond human limitations. The depth of Cold War nuclear anxiety embodied in POSIDISM also helps explain the psychological impact of living under threat of annihilation. When destruction seems inevitable, some will create elaborate justifications for why this might actually be a good thing. We see similar patterns in contemporary apocalyptic thinking across the political spectrum, from religious end times enthusiasts to environmentalists who sometimes welcome human population collapse as necessary for planetary healing. What lessons can we draw from this strange philosophical detour? Perhaps the most important is the danger of revolutionary certainty. Posadas was so convinced of communism's historical inevitability that even nuclear war became interpreted as its midwife rather than its grave. When ideology becomes powerful enough to reframe mass death as progress, it reveals the dangerous capacity of political faith to override basic human values. POSIDISM also demonstrates how movements respond to marginalization. As the group became increasingly isolated from mainstream Trotskyism and broader leftist currents, its theories became more elaborate and esoteric. This pattern of ideological intensification in response to political isolation appears across the political spectrum, from conspiracy communities to religious sects. Yet there's also something strangely hopeful in the posidist vision, despite its horrific premise. In a world facing potential collapse, they never stopped imagining futures beyond the present order. They believed so deeply in the possibility of a better world that they constructed an entire cosmology to explain how it would come about, even if through terrible means. This refusal to accept limits to political possibility represents a twisted form of the utopian imagination that drives all revolutionary politics. In an era once again characterized by existential threats, from climate change to artificial intelligence to renewed nuclear tensions, POSIDISM serves as both warning and provocation. It warns us about how easily revolutionary certainty can justify unconscionable sacrifice, yet it also provokes us to continue imagining possibilities beyond apocalypse. The strangest legacy of this fringe philosophy may be how it continues to resonate in a world that seems increasingly post-sadist, where existential threats multiply, where technology rapidly transforms human existence, and where the future of civilization seems increasingly uncertain. We may reject its embrace of nuclear fire, but in our search for paths through potential civilizational collapse, perhaps we're all becoming a little posidist. The aliens, however, remain silent, at least for now. The repugnant conclusion. The greatest moral imperative of our time isn't fighting climate change, eliminating poverty, or preventing war. It's maximizing the human population, even at the cost of severely reducing everyone's quality of life. This seemingly absurd claim emerges directly from reasonable premises in population ethics, creating what philosophers call the repugnant conclusion. A world filled with billions upon billions of people whose lives are barely worth living is morally superior to a world with a smaller population of extremely happy people. This disturbing conclusion isn't the product of extremist thinking, but the logical result of combining seemingly reasonable moral principles. It arises from the work of respected philosopher Derek Parfit, who wasn't advocating for population maximization, but demonstrating a profound paradox in our moral thinking that remains unresolved after decades of philosophical debate. The repugnant conclusion reveals a fundamental inconsistency in our moral intuitions about population ethics, explains philosopher Larry Temkin. Either we must accept that creating vast numbers of barely worth living lives is the highest moral good, or we must abandon moral principles that seem obviously correct in other contexts. The argument proceeds through deceptively simple steps. First, assume that adding happy people to the world is good, at least when it doesn't harm existing people. Most would agree that increasing the number of people living good lives seems positive. Second, accept that slightly reducing some people's well-being to significantly increase others' well-being can be morally justified. Again, most accept some form of this trade-off principle. Now the trap springs. Start with a world, A, containing 10 billion extremely happy people. Most would consider this excellent. Now consider a world B with 20 billion people, each slightly less happy than those in world A, but still very happy. The total well-being in B exceeds that in A because the slight decrease in individual happiness is outweighed by doubling the population, so B seems better than A. But we can repeat this process. A world, C, with 40 billion slightly less happy people contains more total well-being than B. And so on, through worlds D, E, F, until we reach world Z, containing vast billions of people whose lives are just barely worth living. Lives with minimal pleasures that only slightly outweigh their sufferings. Lives spent in cramped conditions with minimal resources, basic nutrition, and little privacy or opportunity. Yet through this chain of reasoning, World Z contains more total well-being than our original World A. We begin with a world of very happy people, explains philosopher Gustav Arrhenius. Through a series of seemingly reasonable steps, we conclude that a vast population living lives barely worth continuing is better. Most people find this conclusion deeply counterintuitive, yet avoiding it requires rejecting principles that seem obviously correct. The philosophical significance extends beyond abstract reasoning. The repugnant conclusion challenges fundamental assumptions about population ethics that influence real-world issues from family planning to resource allocation. If maximizing total well-being is our goal, governments should encourage maximum reproduction even at the cost of quality of life. This contradicts widespread intuitions that quality matters more than quantity when it comes to human flourishing. Some philosophers embrace the repugnant conclusion, despite its counterintuitive nature. Total utilitarians argue that we should maximize the sum of well-being across all individuals, which logically leads to preferring enormous populations with minimal individual welfare. From this perspective, our intuitive rejection reflects irrational bias rather than moral insight. The apparent repugnance comes from failing to appreciate the moral mathematics, argues utilitarian philosopher Torbjörn Tännsjö. A vast number of lives barely worth living still contains tremendous total value. Our intuitive rejection reflects failure to comprehend large numbers rather than a genuine moral insight. Most philosophers, however, search for ways to escape the conclusion while preserving other moral principles. Average utilitarians suggest we should maximize average well-being rather than total well-being, which avoids the repugnant conclusion but creates other counterintuitive results, such as suggesting that adding very happy people to the world would be wrong if they're slightly less happy than the current average. Critical-level utilitarians propose that creating new lives is only positive if those lives exceed some threshold of well-being, not merely being worth living, but being sufficiently good. This approach avoids the repugnant conclusion, but introduces arbitrary thresholds and potentially troubling implications about the value of actual human lives below the critical level. Variable value views suggest that the moral value of creating new lives diminishes as population increases, similar to the economic principle of diminishing marginal utility. This approach avoids both the repugnant conclusion and problems with average utilitarianism, but seems ad hoc, designed specifically to avoid the unwanted conclusion rather than reflecting independent moral principles. Every attempt to avoid the repugnant conclusion seems to create equally troubling problems elsewhere in our moral framework, observes philosopher Michael Huemer. We're caught in a genuine paradox where our intuitions about population ethics cannot all be simultaneously satisfied. The repugnant conclusion connects to broader questions about the value of existence and whether creating lives can be a moral obligation rather than merely permissible. If bringing happy people into existence is good, does this create moral pressure to reproduce maximally? Does it suggest that abortion and contraception prevent valuable lives from existing? Different responses to the repugnant conclusion generate radically different answers to these practical questions. Religious perspectives typically reject both the repugnant conclusion and its philosophical framework. Most religious traditions value human life for reasons beyond well-being maximization, seeing intrinsic value in human dignity that cannot be reduced to utilitarian calculations. Yet some religious positions encouraging maximum reproduction inadvertently align with the conclusion's practical implications while rejecting its philosophical foundations. The most disturbing aspect isn't the repugnant conclusion itself, but that avoiding it forces abandoning other deeply held moral principles. We must either accept that vast populations with minimal quality of life are morally optimal, or reject seemingly obvious principles like adding happy people to the world is good, or improving people's well-being is good. The repugnant conclusion represents more than a curious paradox, argues philosopher Johann Frick. It reveals fundamental limitations in our ability to construct coherent moral theories about population and future generations. Some combination of our basic moral intuitions must be abandoned. We cannot preserve them all. These theoretical debates gain practical urgency as humanity faces unprecedented control over population size through contraception, reproductive technology, and potentially colonization beyond Earth. The moral frameworks we adopt regarding optimal population directly influence policies on family planning, resource allocation, and long-term species survival. Whether we find the repugnant conclusion genuinely repugnant or ultimately acceptable reveals deep assumptions about what makes human life valuable: quality versus quantity, individual flourishing versus aggregate welfare, the moral status of potential versus actual people. In forcing us to choose between seemingly reasonable moral principles, it exposes contradictions in our ethical intuitions that no philosophical system has satisfactorily resolved. Effective accelerationism. What if the greatest moral imperative of our time isn't fighting climate change, reducing inequality, or promoting human rights, but accelerating technological development as rapidly as possible, regardless of short-term risks or disruptions? This is the provocative premise of effective accelerationism, E/ACC, a philosophy gaining traction in Silicon Valley and beyond that views technological acceleration as an unstoppable force that shouldn't just be accepted, but actively championed and intensified. Acceleration isn't a choice, it's the underlying condition of the universe, declares E/ACC proponent and venture capitalist Mark Andreessen. The question isn't whether to accelerate, but whether to fight a futile battle against the inevitable or harness acceleration's energy to create unprecedented prosperity. Unlike traditional accelerationism, which emerged from Marxist critique and often frames technological acceleration as a means to collapse capitalism, effective accelerationism embraces capitalist mechanisms as essential drivers of innovation. It positions technological progress as an autonomous force with its own logic and momentum, a process humans can channel but not control, and certainly not stop without catastrophic consequences. The philosophy's central argument is deceptively simple. Throughout history, technological advancement has consistently improved human welfare despite temporary disruptions. From agriculture to industrialization to computerization, new technologies initially displaced existing systems, but ultimately created vastly more prosperity. E/ACC takes this historical pattern and extrapolates it forward, arguing that even the most disruptive emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, will ultimately benefit humanity despite near-term risks. What distinguishes EACC from mere technological optimism is its moral framing and sense of urgency. According to its adherents, each day we delay technological advancement represents incalculable opportunity costs in human suffering that could have been alleviated through new medical treatments, economic efficiencies, or scientific breakthroughs. In this view, excessive technological caution becomes morally indefensible, tantamount to allowing preventable suffering to continue. The principle is actually the harmful principle, argues E/ACC theorist and entrepreneur Gary Tan. It dooms billions to continuing poverty and disease by preventing the very innovations that could save them. Technological stagnation isn't neutral, it's actively harmful. Consider artificial intelligence, the domain where E/ACC thinking has become most influential and controversial. While many experts call for slowing AI development to address safety concerns, EACC proponents advocate the opposite, accelerating AI progress as rapidly as possible, viewing existential risk concerns as vastly overstated compared to the benefits of advanced AI systems. They point to potential applications in scientific research, medical discovery, and economic productivity that could save millions of lives and create unprecedented prosperity. Every day we delay artificial general intelligence is a day where 160,000 people die who might have been saved, claims prominent EEACC voice Beth Jesus, a pseudonym, highlighting how accelerationists quantify the opportunity costs of technological caution. This reframing transforms technological development from mere progress into moral imperative, casting anyone advocating caution as potentially complicit in preventable suffering. What makes effective accelerationism particularly controversial isn't just its dismissal of technological risks, but its embrace of creative destruction. Economic disruption, job displacement, social upheaval. These aren't unfortunate side effects to be mitigated but necessary components of progress. The philosophy doesn't deny that AI might eliminate millions of jobs, or that genetic engineering could create new inequalities. It simply argues that attempting to prevent these outcomes would forfeit even greater benefits. You can't get to a radically better future without disrupting the present, explains E/ACC philosopher and tech executive Emil Torres. Looking historically, would we really want to have prevented industrialization because it temporarily disrupted agricultural communities? Embracing acceleration means accepting that genuine progress requires transformation, not preservation. Critics argue that this philosophy represents a dangerous abdication of responsibility. Effective accelerationism is essentially a theological belief in technological salvation that conveniently absolves its adherents from considering the consequences of their actions, contends AI researcher Timnit Gebru. It's the Silicon Valley version of Jesus take the wheel, except with some of the most powerful technologies humanity has ever developed. The controversy intensifies when considering who bears the costs of acceleration. While E/ACC proponents emphasize long-term benefits for humanity as a whole, critics note that disruption's burdens fall disproportionately on vulnerable populations with limited capacity to adapt. When AI eliminates jobs, wealthy technologists aren't typically the ones facing unemployment. When new technologies reshape society, those with resources navigate the transition far more easily than those without. E/ACC represents the ultimate privilege, argues sociologist Zeynep Tufekci. It's easy to embrace move fast and break things when you're not the one being broken. For communities already struggling, technological disruption isn't creative destruction, it's just destruction. Perhaps most controversially, many E/ACC proponents believe we're rapidly approaching a technological singularity, a hypothetical point where artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence and begins improving itself, creating an explosion of intelligence and capability beyond human comprehension. In this view, accelerating toward the singularity becomes the ultimate moral imperative, potentially enabling solutions to all human problems and opening cosmic possibilities currently unimaginable. Effective accelerationism recognizes that we stand at the precipice of the most significant transition in cosmic history, explains philosopher and EEACC advocate David Pearce. The development of superintelligence could eliminate suffering, colonize the cosmos, and produce forms of consciousness and flourishing beyond our current imagination. Against these possibilities, calls for caution seem tragically myopic. This quasi-religious dimension, complete with its own eschatology of technological transcendence, leads some critics to classify EACC as a techno-religion rather than a rational philosophy. The movement has developed its own terminology, symbols, notably the lightning bolt, and in-group signaling that resembles religious communities more than traditional philosophical discourse. What makes EACCC particularly significant is its growing influence in the technology sector, where its adherents aren't merely theorizing, but actively building, funding, and deploying the very technologies they seek to accelerate. From venture capital firms to AI research labs, accelerationist thinking shapes investment decisions, research priorities, and product development strategies with real-world consequences. The philosophy creates strange political alignments. Some progressives embrace acceleration's potential to solve climate change through clean energy breakthroughs. Some libertarians appreciate its critique of regulatory caution. Some conservatives value its defense of creative destruction as economically necessary. What unites these diverse perspectives is belief that technological progress represents humanity's best hope despite inevitable disruptions. Throughout human history, the most reliable driver of human welfare hasn't been ideology, religion, or politics, but technological progress, observes EACC thinker Benjamin Bratton. Doubting the value of acceleration requires extraordinary evidence that somehow this fundamental pattern of human history has suddenly reversed. Whether viewed as clear-eyed realism about technology's unstoppable momentum or dangerous technotopian fantasy, effective accelerationism forces us to examine our relationship with progress itself. In a world facing multiple existential challenges, is our wisest path cautious deliberation or full-throttle acceleration toward technologies that might save us or destroy us? The stakes of this philosophical debate couldn't be higher. Not just the future of technology, but the future of humanity itself. Anti-civilization anarchism. The power grid fails permanently. Cities empty as food deliveries stop. Concrete cracks as plants reclaim streets. Dams collapse, factories rust, and satellites fall from orbit. Billions die in the chaos. The survivors, scattered bands of humans, hunt, gather, and eventually forget the civilization that once dominated the planet. Sound like an apocalyptic nightmare? For anti-civilization anarchists, this represents not catastrophe, but liberation, the necessary collapse of a fundamentally oppressive system, and humanity's return to the only truly free way of life. The entire material and technological infrastructure of civilization represents a prison constructed over 10,000 years, declares anarchist philosopher John Zerzan. Every technological advancement further enslaves humanity to a system that separates us from direct experience, sensory wholeness, and authentic freedom. There is no reforming this system. It must be abandoned entirely. Anti-civilization anarchism, or anti-civ, represents anarchism's most radical and uncompromising form. While traditional anarchists oppose the state but often embrace industrialism, urbanization, and technology, anti-civ anarchists reject civilization itself. The entire complex of agriculture, written language, division of labor, mass society, and technological systems. They view these not as human achievements, but as components of an all-encompassing system of domination that must be completely dismantled for true liberation to occur. The first act of civilization was the creation of surplus through agriculture, explains anti-civ theorist Derek Jensen. Once surplus exists, so does the possibility of inequality, hierarchy, specialization, and every form of domination that followed. The problem isn't just capitalism or the state, it's the entire civilizational project that began with the first planted seed. What distinguishes anti-civ anarchism from related perspectives like primitivism or deep ecology is its specifically anarchist focus on domination and liberation. Where primitivists might emphasize returning to hunter-gatherer lifestyles for their own sake, and deep ecologists focus primarily on ecosystem health, anti-civ anarchists center their critique on how civilization inherently creates and maintains hierarchies incompatible with true freedom. This philosophy traces intellectual roots to multiple sources. Anthropological studies of hunter-gatherer societies showing their egalitarianism and leisure time. Frankfurt School critiques of technological rationality, indigenous perspectives on Western civilization as inherently destructive, and anarchist theory, emphasizing direct action and autonomy. From these diverse influences, emerges a comprehensive rejection of civilization as fundamentally unreformable. The critique encompasses every aspect of civilized life. Agriculture isn't merely a food production method, but a system that segments land, creates property, demands sedentary existence, and produces surplus enabling inequality. Written language isn't just communication, but abstraction that separates humans from direct experience and enables the control of knowledge by specialized classes. Technology isn't neutral, but inherently authoritarian, embedding the values of domination into material infrastructure while requiring ever-increasing extraction and complexity. Every cell phone requires mines, factories, global shipping, rare earth extraction, and eventual toxic disposal, observes anti-civ writer Kevin Tucker. There is no green version of this system possible. It fundamentally requires domination of both nature and humans at every step. The entire technological infrastructure must be abandoned, not reformed. What makes this philosophy particularly controversial isn't just its rejection of technology, but its logical endpoint: the deliberate dismantling of global civilization and the massive population reduction this would necessarily entail. While most anti-civ anarchists don't advocate violence or causing deliberate harm, they acknowledge that billions of humans could not survive a return to hunter-gatherer existence, as Earth's carrying capacity without agriculture would support perhaps 100 million humans at most. Critics across the political spectrum find this aspect morally abhorrent. Humanists argue that civilization, despite its flaws, enables vastly reduced suffering through medical advances, reliable food supplies, and protections against natural dangers. Progressives view the anti-civ position as privileged romance that ignores how abandoning technology would immediately harm society's most vulnerable members. Religious perspectives often see anti-civ thought as rejecting humans' divinely inspired creativity and dominion. Anti-civilization anarchism represents the most profound misanthropy dressed in liberation rhetoric, argues philosopher Steven Pinker. It casually accepts billions of deaths while ignoring civilization's demonstrable benefits, dramatic reductions in violence, disease, infant mortality, and hunger, alongside unprecedented access to knowledge, art, and opportunity. Anti-civ theorists counter that civilization's apparent benefits are temporary illusions, masking catastrophic long-term costs. They point to accelerating climate change, mass extinction, topsoil depletion, ocean acidification, and other ecological crises as evidence that technological civilization is fundamentally unsustainable, destined for collapse, regardless of human choices. From this perspective, the question isn't whether civilization will end, but how, through conscious dismantling or chaotic breakdown. Civilization isn't a choice anymore. It's a death sentence for the biosphere, argues writer Arik McBay. Industrial civilization has initiated the sixth mass extinction, destroyed half Earth's forests, and destabilized global climate. Its collapse is certain. The only choice is whether we let it take most life on Earth with it, or actively dismantle it while some biodiversity remains. This apocalyptic framework creates strategic tensions within the movement. Some advocate withdrawing from civilization to create small-scale subsistence communities. Others promote active resistance through sabotage of industrial infrastructure. Still others focus on preserving knowledge for post-collapse survival, or developing psychological frameworks for an anti-civilizational mindset. These diverse approaches share the conviction that civilization cannot be reformed and must be abandoned. Voting, protesting, recycling, green technology, these are all meaningless within a system fundamentally based on domination and extraction, explains anarchist writer Wolfie Landstreicher. The only meaningful response is to withdraw support from civilization while developing skills and communities independent of its infrastructure. Anti-civ thought generates particularly complex questions around technology. Is all technology inherently dominating, or only certain forms? Where's the line between tool and technology? Would dismantling civilization mean abandoning all complex tools, including medical advances that save lives? Different theorists draw these boundaries differently, though most agree that mass industrial technology necessarily creates hierarchy and ecological destruction. Perhaps the most provocative aspect of anti-civ anarchism is its claim about human nature. Against both conservative beliefs that humans are naturally competitive and progressive views that humans are infinitely malleable, anti-civ anarchists argue that humans evolved specific physical and psychological adaptations for hunter-gatherer life. In this view, civilization's fundamental misery stems from forcing humans to live in ways radically mismatched with our evolved nature, in mass societies rather than small bands, through abstract symbols rather than direct experience, in artificial environments rather than natural ones. For 300,000 years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers in egalitarian bands, notes anthropologist James Sussman. Agriculture and civilization represent just 3% of our species' existence. The psychological and physical mismatches between our hunter-gatherer adaptations and civilized environments explain much modern suffering. Critics argue this view romanticizes pre-civilizational life while ignoring its hardships. High infant mortality, vulnerability to environmental fluctuations, limited options for those with disabilities, and the reality that many hunter-gatherer societies practice their own forms of violence and domination. They question whether contemporary humans raised in civilization could successfully transition to hunter-gatherer lifestyles without massive suffering. Whether viewed as dangerous extremism or clarity about civilization's unsustainability, anti-civilization anarchism forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about progress, freedom, and human nature. It challenges us to consider whether what we call advancement might actually represent enslavement to technology, to artificial environments, to systems that determine our lives without our consent. In questioning whether civilization itself represents a 10,000-year mistake, it presents perhaps the most radical rejection possible of modern society's foundational assumptions.